Somewhere in what is now northern Spain, about 50,000 years ago, a small group of people sat around a fire inside a limestone cave. Outside, the wind was doing what Ice Age winds do, moving fast and cold across a landscape that looked almost nothing like the Europe we know today. Mammoths were grazing on open steppe. Reindeer were picking through frozen sedge. The tree line had retreated south, and the sky was the kind of pale grey that doesn't really commit to either day or night. Inside that cave, those people were warm. They had food, they had each other, and they were Neanderthals. That image is not what most of us grew up with. Most of us learned something much simpler. Neanderthals were primitive, they were brutish. They were the ones who lost. They shuffled through the cold and eventually disappeared, replaced by smarter, more capable modern humans who swept in from Africa and simply outcompeted them. It's a clean story. It's also mostly wrong, or at least far more complicated than that, and the evidence has been quietly rewriting it for decades. That's what this is about. Not a dramatic retelling of extinction, but something slower and more interesting. A careful walk through what we actually know about how Neanderthals lived, how they survived, how they adapted to one of the most demanding environments any human species has ever faced, and why that story matters. If you're settling in right now, getting comfortable, letting the day go, this is a good place to be. We're going somewhere cold and ancient and genuinely fascinating. And before we go any further, if you're listening to this on Spotify, I just want to say that following the channel there is honestly the best thing you can do to support what I make. No ads, no music, just the voice and the history. The link is in the description. It takes about 3 seconds and it means a lot. Now, where were we? Ice Age Eurasia. Here's the first thing to understand, and it's important. The Ice Age was not one single endless winter. That's probably the most persistent myth about this whole period. We tend to imagine it as a frozen world, static and grey, like someone turned the temperature down and left it there for 100,000 years. But climate doesn't work like that. It never has. The period when Neanderthals were at their peak, roughly 400,000 years ago to around 40,000 years ago, was a time of repeated and sometimes violent climate swings. Glacials gave way to interglacials. Tundra became forest, then steppe, then tundra again. Coastlines shifted. Rivers changed course. Animal populations moved, shrank, exploded, vanished. Neanderthals lived through all of it. That's the part that gets lost. These were not creatures frozen in one moment of deep cold. They were flexible, responsive, and persistent across an enormous stretch of time and geography. They lived in what is now Portugal and what is now Uzbekistan. They hunted horses in France and ibex in the Zagros Mountains. They built fires in caves in Gibraltar and camped in open-air sites on the Russian plain. If you had to summarize their defining characteristic in one word, adaptable might be the best you could do. But here's where we have to be careful, and where this series tries to do something a little different. There's a temptation, when telling this kind of story, to fill in the gaps with imagination, to describe Neanderthal thoughts and feelings and conversations with the same confidence you'd describe a historical figure from a few centuries ago. Some documentaries do this, some popular books do this, and it makes for compelling viewing, but it's not quite honest about what we actually know versus what we're guessing. What we actually have is bones. We have stone tools by the millions, literally millions of them, scattered across cave floors and river terraces from the Atlantic coast to the foothills of Central Asia. We have hearths, ancient fire sites preserved in layers of sediment, some of them used and reused over thousands of years. We have pollen records trapped in lake sediments that tell us what the vegetation looked like during different periods. We have isotope analysis from Neanderthal teeth that can reconstruct what seasons they were born in, what they ate, where they grew up, and how far they travelled. And we have ancient DNA, ancient genetics extracted from bones found in Croatian caves and Siberian mountains, and a Belgian site called Spy, and that DNA has told us things about Neanderthal life that no amount of digging could have revealed on its own. That's the toolkit. Bones, tools, hearths, sediments, isotopes, ancient DNA. Each one gives us a partial picture. Put them together carefully, honestly, with appropriate uncertainty about what's missing, and you start to see something remarkable. You start to see a population of humans who are genuinely good at being alive in a cold and unpredictable world. That's the journey we're taking tonight. Slow and careful, season by season, landscape by landscape, skill by skill. We're going to look at what the Ice Age actually felt like in its different phases, how Neanderthal bodies were shaped by cold in ways you can still measure in their skeletons, how they used fire not just as warmth, but as a kind of technology that reorganized their whole relationship to the environment, how they chose where to sleep and why those choices mattered, how they made clothing from animal hides well before modern humans arrived in Europe, how their tools, the Mousterian industry that defines them archaeologically, were more sophisticated than the old cartoon suggested, how they hunted large, dangerous animals in coordinated ways that required communication and planning, how they ate far more than just mammoth steaks, how they cared for their sick and elderly in ways that leave marks in the fossil record, how they moved with the seasons, following animals and tracking the slow rhythms of a climate that never quite stayed the same, and eventually we'll get to the meeting. The moment, or rather the long drawn-out process, when Neanderthals and Homo sapiens occupied the same landscapes and what that actually looked like versus what popular culture has suggested it looked like. The ending of the Neanderthal story is the part everyone thinks they know. And it's also the part where the evidence is most interesting, most contested, and most worth sitting with slowly rather than rushing to a conclusion. But we're not there yet. We're at the beginning. And I want you to just hold on to that image for a moment. A limestone cave somewhere in northern Spain. Firelight. Wind outside. A small group of people who have spent their entire lives learning how to survive in a world that periodically tried to freeze, starve, and scatter them. They're not impressive because they're exotic or primitive. They're impressive because they're still there, generation after generation after generation, holding on in a landscape that required everything they had just to get through a single winter. If you're listening to this in bed right now or on a late commute or somewhere quiet with the lights off, I'd love to know where you are and what time it is where you're listening. Drop it in the comments. I read them. There's something I genuinely love about the fact that someone in Edinburgh might be hearing this at midnight while someone in Melbourne hears it over morning coffee, and all of us are thinking about the same cold ancient world together. Now get comfortable. We're going back a long way, so let's slow down and actually look at the world Neanderthals were living in, because the phrase Ice Age does a lot of work in our heads that it probably shouldn't. When most people hear Ice Age, they picture something permanent, a world locked under ice and snow, grey and featureless, stretching from horizon to horizon without interruption. That picture exists, but it only describes one phase of a much longer and much more varied story. The period that covers Neanderthal existence, roughly 400,000 years to about 40,000 years ago, included multiple glacial cycles. That means multiple episodes of severe cold, but also multiple warm intervals in between. Scientists call these warm periods interglacials, and during them, temperatures in parts of Europe could rise close to what we experience today, sometimes briefly warmer. Forests expanded northward. Sea levels rose as ice sheets melted. The landscape transformed, sometimes within a few human generations. Then things swung back. A glacial maximum, the deepest, coldest phase of a glacial cycle, looked genuinely severe. Ice sheets covered much of northern Europe. Britain and Scandinavia were buried. Sea levels dropped dramatically as water was locked up in ice, exposing coastal shelves that are now underwater. The North Sea, as we know it, didn't exist. You could walk from Britain to continental Europe. The tree line retreated far to the south. Vast stretches of land between the ice sheets became something like cold steppe or tundra, open grasslands swept by dry winds carrying fine, silty sediment called loess, which built up in thick deposits that geologists still read today like the pages of a slow book. But here's the important complication. Neanderthals didn't just live through glacial maxima. Most of their time they were living in the phases between. The build-up to cold, the retreat from cold, the warm intervals that could last thousands of years, and within any given phase there were also rapid fluctuations. Scientists studying ice cores drilled from Greenland have identified what are called Dansgaard-Oeschger events, sudden lurches in climate that could swing temperatures by several degrees within decades. Not centuries, not millennia. Decades. For a Neanderthal group with a lifespan of maybe 30 or 40 years, a climate shift that played out across a single generation would have been felt as a profound change in the world. This is how scientists reconstruct all of this, and it's worth pausing on that for a moment, because the methods are quietly extraordinary. Ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica trap tiny air bubbles from ancient atmospheres, preserving records of temperature, greenhouse gas concentrations, and even volcanic eruptions going back hundreds of thousands of years. Pollen preserved in lake sediments and cave deposits tells researchers what plants were growing at a given time and in what proportions, which tells them whether a landscape was forested or open, warm or cold. Loose deposits record wind patterns and glacial activity. Speleothems, the slow-growing formations inside caves like stalactites and stalagmites, incorporate oxygen isotopes from rainwater as they form, creating chemical records of past climate that can be dated with remarkable precision. Put all of these together and you get something that isn't quite a weather forecast for 80,000 years ago, but it's much closer than you might expect. What those records show, consistently, is a patchwork. Not one uniform Ice Age world, but a mosaic of environments varying by latitude, elevation, proximity to the ocean, and local geography. And Neanderthals occupied a striking range of positions within that mosaic. In southern Iberia, the area that is now Portugal and Spain, conditions stayed relatively mild even during glacial peaks. The Atlantic moderated temperatures, forests held on in sheltered valleys, coastal resources, shellfish, marine mammals, fish, remained available. Neanderthals living there faced cold winters but not the deep continental cold of Central Europe. In the Zagros Mountains of what is now Iran and Iraq, they were hunting ibex and wild cattle in a rugged highland environment that had its own seasonal rhythms, hot dry summers and cold winters, very different from anything in Western Europe. In the river valleys of France, they camped along watercourses that concentrated animal life and provided both food and water through difficult seasons. In Gibraltar, at the far southern tip of Europe, some of the last Neanderthal populations lived in caves overlooking a coastline that gave them access to the sea even as the rest of Europe was in deep cold. The forest edges were particularly important. There's a temptation to picture Neanderthals as creatures of the open steppe, trudging across frozen grasslands after mammoths. Some of them did exactly that. The open steppe sites in Central and Eastern Europe show evidence of large-scale hunting, probably of horse, bison, and mammoth. But the archaeological record also shows heavy use of woodland and transitional environments, the edges where forest met grassland, where different animal species overlapped, where plant resources were more varied. These transitional zones would have been productive in ways that pure open steppe wasn't. More species, more seasonal plant foods, more shelter from wind, easier access to wood for fire. River valleys served a similar function. Water draws animals, animals draw hunters, but valleys also provide a kind of topographic shelter, protection from wind, more stable microclimates, easier access to the flint and chert outcrops that Neanderthals needed for their tools. When researchers map Neanderthal site locations against the reconstructed paleogeography of a given region, river valleys show up disproportionately. This wasn't random. It was a pattern of deliberate landscape use, shaped by knowledge passed down through generations. Which brings up the myth worth correcting here. The idea that Neanderthals were essentially tundra specialists, cold-adapted creatures who could only survive in open, frozen environments. It's a persistent image, and it's wrong in a fairly fundamental way. Yes, Neanderthals developed physical adaptations to cold. We'll talk about those in detail shortly. And yes, some Neanderthal populations did live in very cold open environments, but their range extended across an enormous band of latitude and climate. Some of those environments were temperate forests, some were Mediterranean coastlines, some were mountain valleys, some were near desert margins in the Middle East. Calling them tundra specialists is a bit like summarizing human habitation today by pointing to the people living in northern Canada and saying humans are Arctic animals. True in a narrow sense, misleading as a generalization. What the actual record suggests is something more interesting. Neanderthals were landscape generalists within a particular broad climate band, capable of adjusting their strategies, their diets, their movements, their tool-making emphasis, based on the specific conditions they were living in. The variation in their archaeological sites reflects this. Different tool assemblages in different regions, different faunal remains, which animals they were eating, how those animals were processed, different patterns of raw material used depending on what stone was locally available. And local conditions really did matter more than any global average temperature could capture. A site in a sheltered valley in southern France might have experienced conditions that were meaningfully warmer and more productive than an open plain 50 miles to the north during the same period. A coastal cave could offer resources that an inland site couldn't, regardless of the broad climate phase. When scientists try to understand Neanderthal survival, they've increasingly moved away from thinking about global temperature curves and toward thinking about what specific local environments looked like in terms of food availability, shelter potential, and seasonal predictability. The world Neanderthals navigated was not a single terrible winter. It was a shifting, varied, sometimes violent and sometimes generous patchwork of conditions, spread across a vast geography and a long sweep of time. They read that landscape in ways we're still trying to reconstruct. They moved through it, adapted to it, built their lives within it, and the evidence left behind in ice and pollen and stone and bone is our slow way of reading those lives back, one careful layer at a time. Now, all of that environmental pressure had to go somewhere, and for Neanderthals a great deal of it went into the body itself. When we look at a Neanderthal skeleton, the first thing that tends to strike people is how solid it looks. Not just big, solid, dense, built in a way that suggests something working very hard against very difficult conditions. And there's real science behind that impression, though it's worth being careful about how far we take it. The pattern in the bones is called a cold adapted body plan, and it follows a principle that biologists have been observing in warm-blooded animals for a long time. Animals living in colder climates tend to have larger, more compact bodies than closely related animals living in warmer regions. They also tend to have shorter limbs relative to body length. The geometric logic here is fairly elegant. A larger body has more volume relative to its surface area, and surface area is where heat escapes. So a compact, heavy-bodied animal loses heat more slowly than a slender, long-limbed one of equivalent mass. This is called Bergmann's rule, and Allen's rule is the companion observation about limbs specifically. Shorter arms and legs mean less surface area at the extremities, which in cold-blooded terms are the places most vulnerable to rapid heat loss. Neanderthal skeletons fit this pattern. Their limbs were short relative to their overall body size. Their bodies were wide through the chest and hips. Their bones were dense and heavily muscled, judging by the stress marks left by muscle attachments. Average Neanderthal body mass estimates vary by study, but they consistently come in higher than for modern humans of similar height. Some estimates suggest the additional muscle and bone density would have pushed their resting metabolic requirements considerably higher than a modern human of the same stature. All of that tissue cost energy to maintain, but it also generates heat, and it holds heat longer. Now it's tempting to read this and conclude that Neanderthals were simply cold weather machines, bodies engineered by evolution to thrive in exactly the environments they occupied. That's a cleaner story than the evidence really supports. The body plan is real, the parallels to other cold-adapted mammals are real, but the interpretation requires more caution. For one thing, Neanderthal body proportions varied. Populations living in the colder, more continental parts of Europe do show more extreme versions of the compact, short-limbed build. But Neanderthals in the Levant, in the Middle East, show somewhat different proportions, closer to what you might expect in populations living in less extreme cold. This matches the cold adaptation model in a general way, since it suggests the pattern was responsive to actual climate rather than being a fixed universal trait. But it also reminds us that Neanderthals were not one monolithic type. Their bodies varied, probably in ways that track the environments different populations had been living in for many generations. There's also the question of what the compact build cost them. Cold adaptation through mass and density is energetically expensive to maintain. A body running that kind of metabolic engine needs a lot of fuel. Estimates of daily caloric needs for Neanderthals during winter months run quite high, some researchers suggesting figures upwards of 4,000 or 5,000 calories per day under active cold conditions. That's not a background detail, that's a central fact of their existence. Their bodies may have been efficient at keeping heat in, but they also required constant, reliable, substantial input of energy just to keep running. Every adaptation comes with its own set of demands. Then there are the faces. Neanderthal facial anatomy is distinctive in several ways that have attracted enormous attention and generated quite a lot of debate. The large nasal region is probably the most discussed feature. Neanderthal noses were broad and prominent. The nasal passages, as far as researchers can reconstruct them from bone, were large. The popular hypothesis is that this served a thermal and humidification function. When you breathe very cold, very dry air through an efficient nasal passage, the architecture of the nose can warm and moisten that air before it reaches the lungs. Breathing extremely cold air directly is hard on the respiratory system, and a nose that conditions the air before it goes deeper would matter a great deal if you're spending most of your waking hours outdoors in winter conditions. This is a plausible hypothesis. It fits the anatomy. It fits the known biology of cold air breathing in other mammals. But it remains a hypothesis, because soft tissue doesn't fossilize. What we have are the bones that once supported and surrounded those passages. Reconstructing exactly what the functional passages looked like from those bones requires assumptions. Different researchers have produced different reconstructions, and the debate about exactly how the Neanderthal nasal system worked compared to modern humans is still genuinely open. Some studies using computational airflow modelling have supported the warming and humidification idea. Others have complicated the picture by suggesting that Neanderthal nasal anatomy might have been less efficient at air conditioning than early models proposed, or that some of the distinctive facial architecture might have had more to do with bite mechanics or developmental patterns than with breathing cold air. The honest answer is probably that multiple factors shaped Neanderthal facial anatomy simultaneously, and passing out exactly how much of it was specific cold adaptation versus other selective pressures is difficult from the evidence currently available. What we can say with more confidence is that the combination of body mass, limb proportions and facial architecture, taken together, does cluster in ways consistent with populations that had been living in cold climates for a very long time. Not one single smoking gun adaptation, but a constellation of features that, when read together, tells a consistent story about long-term cold exposure. The musculature is worth pausing on separately, because it sometimes gets overshadowed by the conversation about skeleton and face. Neanderthal bones show evidence of extraordinary muscular development. The attachment points where muscles anchor to bone are often dramatically larger and more pronounced than in modern human skeletons. This suggests a level of physical exertion through life that would have been remarkable by any standard. Some of that load was probably hunting, which we'll come to in a later section. But some of it was almost certainly just the baseline cost of moving through and living in cold, difficult terrain, wearing heavy hides, carrying loads, processing carcasses in the open air. Muscle generates heat. An extremely muscular body generates more resting heat than a lean one. In cold conditions, that matters, but again, it also demands fuel. This brings us to the correction that's worth making explicitly, because the popular image of Neanderthal cold adaptation tends to slide towards something too comfortable. The image of a body so perfectly tuned to Ice Age conditions that cold became almost irrelevant. That's not what the evidence shows. What it shows is a body that had been shaped by long-term cold selection to be somewhat better at conserving heat and somewhat more robust in cold conditions than it might otherwise have been. But somewhat better and somewhat more robust are not the same thing as invulnerable. Cold still killed. Cold still demanded constant management. A Neanderthal with the most cold-adapted body plan on record would still have been in serious trouble without fire, without shelter, without clothing, without adequate food. The biological adaptations didn't replace the behavioral ones. They supplemented them. They raised the floor slightly, maybe bought time in situations where a differently built body might have failed faster. But they didn't transform cold into something trivially handled. The evidence for behavioral cold management, which we're going to spend some time on, is extensive precisely because the body alone was not enough. There's also the question of what happened when conditions changed rapidly. If a population had spent many generations adapting to deep cold, and then the climate lurched toward warmth, which it did, repeatedly, during the Dansgaard-Oeschger events mentioned earlier, those same physical traits that helped in cold might have become neutral, or even slightly costly. A high-calorie body in a period of climate warming and resource shift is an expensive machine to run. The populations that survived long-term were probably those that could maintain behavioral flexibility, alongside whatever biological adaptations they carried. All of which is to say that reading Neanderthal biology is an exercise in holding multiple things at once. Yes, they had physical traits consistent with cold adaptation. Yes, those traits likely helped. But those traits existed within a web of other needs, metabolic costs, behavioral strategies, environmental variation, and climate instability that makes any simple story about bodies built to conquer winter more dramatic than accurate. The bodies were real. The adaptations were real. The limits of those adaptations were equally real. And everything else Neanderthals did to stay alive, every fire lit, every hide scraped, every shelter chosen, was built on top of and around what their bodies could and couldn't do on their own. So the bodies helped, but the bodies weren't enough. And if there's one thing that sits at the centre of almost every serious discussion of Neanderthal survival in cold climates, it's fire. Not fire as a convenience. Not fire as a lucky accident occasionally stumbled upon. Fire as something managed, maintained, and understood. Fire as, in a real sense, technology. The popular image tends to be simpler than that. A single flame in the dark, a Neanderthal huddled, close against the cold, grateful for warmth. That image isn't wrong exactly. Warmth was real and important, but it captures only one dimension of what fire actually meant in the context of a life spent in Ice Age conditions, and probably the least technically interesting one. Before getting to what fire did, it's worth being precise about how we know they had it at all. The evidence comes in several forms, and each form tells a slightly different part of the story. The most direct is the hearth itself. Structured hearths, meaning areas of burned sediment arranged in a roughly circular pattern, consistent with an intentional fire, have been found at Neanderthal sites across Europe and the Middle East. Kebera Cave in Israel, Tabun, Salzgitter Liebenstedt in Germany, Les Canalettes in France. The list is substantial. These aren't ambiguous scorches. They're organised features that appear repeatedly in contexts where Neanderthals were living and working. Then there are ash lenses, thin compressed layers of ash preserved within the stratigraphy of cave and rock shelter sites. These suggest repeated burning in the same location over time, which implies not just fire use, but some degree of habitual return to particular fire spots. Burned bone is another marker. When bone is heated intentionally, often as part of cooking or as fuel when wood was scarce, it changes colour in predictable ways depending on temperature and exposure time. Neanderthal sites frequently show animal bones with these heat signatures, distributed in ways consistent with deliberate burning rather than random wildfire exposure. Thermally altered stone adds another layer. Certain toolmaking techniques benefit from heating flint or other siliceous stone before knapping. Heat treatment changes the fracture properties of stone, making it easier to produce thin, sharp flakes. There's evidence that Neanderthal stoneworkers understood this, or at least practiced it. Some assemblages show lithics that bear the characteristic luster and altered fracture patterns of stones that were heated before being worked. Whether they fully understood the chemistry or arrived at the practice empirically through observation and trial is something we can't know. But the outcome suggests purposeful manipulation of fire in service of a technical goal that had nothing to do with warmth, which is the larger point worth sitting with. Warmth was one function of fire among several. Light was another, not a trivial one. Caves and rock shelters, which Neanderthals used extensively during cold periods, are dark beyond the entrance zone. Any activity taking place deeper in those spaces required light to be possible at all. There's evidence of occupation extending well into the interior of certain sites, which implies that illumination was being managed somehow. Fire is the obvious answer. What it permitted, the use of sheltered interior space for sleeping, toolmaking, social gathering, is hard to overstate in terms of survival value. Cooking is a third function, and probably the one with the most significant downstream effects on nutrition. When meat is cooked, the proteins partially denature, and the fats become more bioavailable. The caloric yield from cooked food is meaningfully higher than from raw food of the same weight. For a body with the kind of metabolic demands discussed earlier, that difference was not trivial. It could have been the margin between adequate nutrition and slow starvation during a hard winter. Burned and heat-fractured bone consistent with marrow extraction, and cooking appears regularly in Neanderthal assemblages. This wasn't occasional. It looks habitual. Predator deterrence is harder to quantify, but worth including as a reasonable inference. Large predators, cave bears, cave lions, hyenas, were competitors for the same sheltered spaces Neanderthals were using. Fire at an entrance would have created a significant barrier for animals that have instinctive aversions to flame and smoke. The co-occurrence of Neanderthal occupation and large carnivore activity at sites like Kebara suggests some degree of ongoing competition for these spaces, which makes a behavioural deterrent like fire practically valuable beyond just its direct effects on the human occupants. Now, the open question that any honest treatment of this subject has to address is how consistently and reliably fire was actually maintained across different regions and different time periods, and the honest answer is that we don't fully know. The preservation of fire evidence is uneven. Organic material burns, and what doesn't burn tends to degrade. Open-air sites, which Neanderthals certainly use seasonally, preserve fire evidence poorly compared to cave and rock shelter contexts. The absence of fire evidence in the archaeological record of a particular site or period doesn't necessarily mean fire was absent. It may mean the evidence didn't survive. There's also real geographic and temporal variation in how much fire evidence appears in the record, and researchers have debated what to make of it. Some studies, particularly of earlier Neanderthal-associated contexts in northern Europe, found lower densities of clear hearth evidence than in the Levantine record or in later European sites. One interpretation is that fire use was genuinely less reliable or systematic in those times and places, perhaps because reliable fire-starting technology was still developing, or because certain raw materials for fire starting were less available. Another interpretation is that preservation conditions are worse for those contexts, and we're seeing a taphonomic bias rather than a behavioural one. The debate is ongoing, and the evidence doesn't settle it cleanly either way. What does seem difficult to argue is the older framing that fire use among Neanderthals was rare, intermittent, or essentially accidental. The cumulative weight of the evidence doesn't support that. Multiple sites across a wide geographic range spanning tens of thousands of years of occupation show organised hearths, repeated burning, thermal alteration of tools and bone. That's not the signature of occasional opportunistic access to naturally occurring fire. That's the signature of a population that knew how to make fire or reliably maintain it, and that had integrated fire into the practical fabric of daily life. The practical realities of maintaining fire under Ice Age conditions are worth thinking about, because they illuminate how much cognitive and logistical effort this would have required. Wood was the primary fuel in most environments, but wood quality and availability varied enormously. During deep cold phases, tree cover in much of Europe was sparse or absent. Neanderthals living on the periglacial steppe would have relied on whatever combustibles were available: dried grasses, bone, fat-soaked materials, and wood gathered from whatever riparian or sheltered woodland persisted nearby. Bone, particularly marrow-rich bone, burns reasonably well once the marrow is ignited, and there's evidence it was used as fuel at some sites where wood was likely scarce. Carrying embers was probably essential, and probably more common than starting fires from scratch. Starting a fire through percussion or friction is not a casual task. It requires dry materials, skill, and time. Under wet or windy conditions, it becomes considerably harder, and in extreme cold, numb fingers make fine motor tasks like fire starting genuinely difficult. The more efficient strategy, and almost certainly the one used most of the time, was keeping a fire going rather than repeatedly starting new ones. That means tending the fire, feeding it carefully to keep embers alive through the night, banking coals against wind, protecting them from rain, carrying embers in some kind of container when moving between locations. None of these things are beyond cognitive reach. All of them require attention, planning, and some degree of shared responsibility within a group. That last point connects to something worth emphasizing. Managing fire consistently across seasons and changing conditions was a collective task. Someone had to tend the fire when others were hunting. Someone had to know how to find appropriate fuel in a new location when a group moved. Knowledge about fire, where to find flint for starting it, how to read weather for good kindling conditions, how to keep coals alive in a hide container during travel, was the kind of knowledge that had to be transmitted between individuals and across generations. Fire management was social infrastructure as much as it was a physical technology. None of this turns Neanderthal fire use into something that needs to be dramatized to be impressive. The evidence on its own is enough. Structured hearths in sheltered spaces, thermally altered tools made with a purpose, burned bone from animals that were cooked rather than simply killed, repeated occupation of fire-associated locations over thousands of years. What it adds up to is a picture of a species that had incorporated fire into its life in a deep and functional way, not as a luxury, not as an accident, but as part of the practical foundation that made winter survivable. The warmth was real, but the warmth was almost the least of it. Fire helped define where Neanderthals could be, but the question of where, specifically, is one worth examining carefully, because the answer is considerably more interesting than the standard image suggests. The cave. It's the image most people carry. A dark opening in a cliff face, a Neanderthal silhouette against firelight, the smell of smoke and damp rock. That image isn't fabricated. Caves and rock shelters genuinely appear throughout the Neanderthal archaeological record, and they were genuinely useful. But treating cave dwelling as the default Neanderthal lifestyle misrepresents what the evidence actually shows, and it flattens a much more deliberate and sophisticated relationship with landscape. Start with what caves and rock shelters actually offered, because understanding that helps clarify why they were used when they were used. The obvious answer is shelter from wind and precipitation. In Ice Age Europe, where temperatures during cold phases could drop to levels that made exposed sleeping genuinely life-threatening, having a solid roof and 3 solid walls removed a significant portion of the cold weather mortality risk. Rock also holds heat. A cave that has been warmed by a fire retains that warmth longer than an open structure would. The thermal mass of the surrounding stone acts as a buffer, slowing heat loss through the night. In a deep winter context, that buffering effect could have been the difference between a survivable night and a dangerous one. Rock shelters, which are shallower than caves proper, ledges and overhangs rather than true cave systems, offered many of the same advantages with more light and easier access. They appear at least as frequently in the Neanderthal record as deep caves, and in some regions more so. They could be warmed more quickly, maintained better ventilation for a sustained fire, and allowed easier observation of the surrounding landscape, which mattered when large predators were a real consideration. But here's what the evidence also shows clearly. Neanderthals were not simply seeking whatever cave or overhang was nearest and staying in it. The site selection patterns visible across the archaeological records suggest something much more considered, a reading of the landscape that incorporated multiple variables simultaneously. Southern exposure was one of those variables. In the northern hemisphere, a south-facing slope or cave entrance receives significantly more direct sunlight across the day, particularly in winter when the sun tracks low across the sky. This isn't a trivial difference. A south-facing rock shelter in midwinter receives hours more solar warming than a north-facing one at the same elevation. The entrance and immediately surrounding area would be warmer, snow would clear faster, and the microclimate just outside the shelter would be meaningfully more hospitable. When researchers have examined the orientation of Neanderthal sites across Europe, south and southwest facing exposures appear with a frequency that's difficult to explain as chance. It looks like a preference that required reading the landscape and selecting accordingly. Windbreaks were another consideration. A site positioned behind a natural ridge, tucked into a valley bend, or sheltered by a rock formation upwind of the prevailing weather direction, would experience dramatically less wind chill than an exposed position at the same elevation. In the periglacial environments of Ice Age Europe, where cold wind off glaciated regions was a constant factor in winter, positioning relative to wind was likely as important as any other variable. Many of the most repeatedly occupied Neanderthal sites are located in valley settings or cliff-based positions that would have provided exactly this kind of natural protection. Water access appears consistently in site selection as well. Not proximity to flooding risk, but reliable proximity to a water source that didn't freeze solid in winter, a fast-moving river section, a spring-fed stream, a seep emerging from a cliff base. Finding water under snow is possible, but it's energy expensive and time-consuming. A camp positioned within practical daily range of an unfrozen water source removed one layer of logistical pressure during the coldest months. And then there's the question of game corridors. This one is harder to confirm directly from site locations, but the logic is straightforward and the circumstantial evidence supports it. Large herd animals in Ice Age Europe move predictably through the landscape. Valleys funneled movement. River crossings concentrated animals at particular points. Narrow passes between ridges created natural bottlenecks. A group camped near one of these features was positioned not just for shelter, but for hunting. The spatial relationship between major Neanderthal occupation sites and the topographic features that would have concentrated animal movement in those regions is a line of inquiry that archaeologists have pursued, and while the evidence is complex, site positions in valley settings near natural game crossings appear more often than a random distribution would predict. All of this describes a kind of landscape literacy that gets underappreciated in popular accounts. Neanderthals were not simply finding the nearest cave and occupying it. They were reading terrain, reading exposure, reading water and wind and animal movement, and making decisions about where to be and when. That's not instinct. That's accumulated knowledge applied to a complex problem. Now, the question of built structures. This is where the evidence gets genuinely complicated, and where it's worth being careful about what can and can't be claimed. There are Neanderthal-associated sites, open-air sites in particular, where the spatial distribution of stone tools, animal bones and other debris suggests organised use of space, consistent with some kind of constructed shelter or windbreak. The site of Molodova in Ukraine, dating to around 44,000 years ago, and associated with a Mousterian tool industry, has been interpreted by some researchers as showing evidence of a mammoth bone structure, a ring of large bones that may have supported a hide covering. The interpretation is not universally accepted. The arrangement could reflect other processes, but it doesn't easily dismiss either. In France, some sites show distributions of lithic material and faunal remains that cluster in patterns suggestive of interior living spaces, as though activities were being organised around a central area that may have been defined by a structure. These spatial patterns can be produced by other causes, but they appear in enough context and with enough consistency that the possibility of constructed shelters at open-air sites is taken seriously by researchers working in this period. What's not in serious dispute is that open-air occupation was real and regular. The old framing that positioned caves as the primary or default Neanderthal habitat has given way to a more nuanced understanding. Open-air sites, riverbank camps, hilltop positions used seasonally for hunting, valley floor locations occupied during specific resource-rich periods, these all appear in the record. Some of these locations show repeated occupation across multiple periods, suggesting they were recognized as good seasonal stopping points and returned to deliberately. The Neanderthal relationship with the landscape was probably more seasonal and more mobile than the cave-dwelling image implies, with caves and rock shelters serving as cold season anchors and open-air locations used during more temperate periods. Then there's the question of bedding, which is one of the more quietly fascinating corners of Neanderthal archaeology. The floor of a cave is cold stone. Sleeping directly on it through a winter night would cause significant heat loss through conduction, even with a fire burning nearby. Some form of insulating layer between the body and the ground was almost certainly in use. The evidence for it is indirect by nature, because organic materials don't preserve well across tens of thousands of years, but there are a few threads worth following. Grass and plant matter are the most likely primary bedding material. Layers of phytoliths, the microscopic silica structures produced by plants, have been identified in the sediments of some Neanderthal sites, at locations consistent with sleeping or resting areas. At Sibudu Cave in South Africa, early modern human bedding made of plant material has been identified in deposits of similar age, showing that the practice of constructing plant-based sleeping surfaces was within the behavioural range of humans from this general period. For Neanderthals, the direct evidence is thinner, but the inference is reasonable. Animal hides would have served the same function, and likely were used in combination with plant material. The processing marks on animal bones at Neanderthal sites include patterns consistent with careful hide removal, suggesting hides were being used for something, and bedding is at least as likely a destination as clothing, probably more so in terms of sheer insulating value. What all of this adds up to is a picture quite different from the simple cave-dwelling narrative. Neanderthals chose their locations carefully, weighing sun angle and wind direction and water access, and the movement of prey through the valley below. They occupied caves when caves offered the best combination of those variables, and they camped in the open when that made more sense seasonally. They may have constructed shelters in some of those open locations, though the evidence for that remains an active area of research and debate. They almost certainly slept on insulated surfaces, though the specifics are inferred from fragmentary traces rather than preserved examples. The selection of a campsite was not a passive act. It was a decision, informed by knowledge of the landscape, the season, the weather, and the practical demands of the days ahead. That kind of deliberate reading of place, that sense of where to be and why, may not be one of the more dramatic aspects of Neanderthal life to contemplate. But it was quietly one of the most essential things they did. There is something inherently frustrating about trying to reconstruct Neanderthal clothing. Not because the question is unimportant, and not because researchers haven't tried, but because fabric doesn't fossilize, hide doesn't fossilize, thread, if it existed, doesn't fossilize. The things you most want to examine have almost entirely vanished from the record, leaving behind only the tools used to make them and the faint chemical traces they left on stone. This is a familiar problem in prehistoric archaeology, but it's especially acute here because the stakes of the question are higher than they might initially appear. Whether or not Neanderthals had effective portable insulation, something they could wear on their bodies and carry with them as they moved through the landscape, has real implications for understanding their range, their mobility, and their capacity to survive the coldest phases of the Ice Age. Clothing is not a luxury in a periglacial environment. It is, past a certain temperature threshold, the difference between a functioning body and a dead one. So what can actually be said, honestly and carefully, about Neanderthal clothing? Start with the tools, because that's where the most direct evidence lives. Scrapers are among the most common implements found at Neanderthal sites, and they appear in enormous quantities across virtually every period and region of Neanderthal occupation. Scrapers are tools designed to remove fat, membrane and connective tissue from the inner surface of an animal hide. That's their primary function. You can use a scraper for other things, but hide working is what the morphology and the wear patterns consistently point to. And the wear patterns matter here. Lithic use wear analysis, the microscopic examination of how the cutting edge of a stone tool has been modified by use, can identify what material a tool was worked against. Hides produce a distinctive polish on stone edges, different from the wear signatures left by wood, bone or plant material. Studies of scrapers from multiple Neanderthal sites have confirmed hide-working wear patterns in significant numbers of tools across sites separated by tens of thousands of years and hundreds of miles of geography. This isn't inference. This is physical evidence preserved in the stone itself. Residue analysis has added another layer. Some Neanderthal stone tools have been examined for organic residues using chemical methods, and traces consistent with animal fat and protein, the kind of residue left by processing fresh hides, have been identified on scraper edges at several sites. It's fragmentary evidence, and researchers are careful about overstating it, but it fits with the wear pattern data and with the general picture of intensive animal processing that the faunal record from Neanderthal sites already suggests. Then there's the question of what happens to the hides once they've been scraped. A freshly scraped hide is still stiff and prone to rot. Making it wearable requires further working, stretching it repeatedly while it dries, perhaps treating it with fat or brain tissue to keep it flexible, a technique used in virtually every ethnographically documented hide-working tradition in the world. Awls and pointed bone tools capable of piercing hide for simple fastenings have been found at some Neanderthal sites, though the evidence is sparser here than for scrapers and requires more careful interpretation. The presence of such tools doesn't prove clothing manufacture, but it's consistent with the general direction the other evidence points. Ethnographic analogy, the practice of drawing reasoned parallels from documented human cultures in comparable environments, fills in some of the interpretive gaps. Indigenous peoples across Arctic and subarctic regions have, in every documented case, developed highly effective hide-based clothing systems. The materials and some of the basic techniques vary, but the underlying logic is consistent. Animal hides, with their fur intact or removed depending on intended use, are layered and secured against the body to trap still air, and it is that trapped air, warmed by the body and held in place by the hide, that provides insulation. The physics of this don't change across cultures or across time. If Neanderthals were processing hides extensively, which the tool record suggests they were, then using those hides as body coverings is not a large inferential leap. It is, in fact, the most straightforward explanation for what they were doing with them. What's less certain, and worth being clear about, is the complexity and form of whatever they produced. Some popular reconstructions give Neanderthals what look essentially like modern winter coats, with shaped panels, fitted sleeves, and close construction. Others, in an overcorrection, deny them any clothing at all, appealing to their cold-adapted physique as evidence they didn't need it. Both positions misrepresent the evidence and misunderstand the problem. The robust Neanderthal body, with its barrel chest, short limbs, and significant fat reserves, does represent genuine physiological cold adaptation. These features would have reduced heat loss and improved thermal efficiency compared to more linear body forms. But physiological adaptation and technological adaptation are not mutually exclusive. They exist on a spectrum, and real populations in real environments use both simultaneously. Even highly cold-adapted bodies lose heat rapidly in wet conditions, in wind, at temperatures well below the range that fat and muscle alone can offset. Frostbite becomes a serious risk at exposed extremities, ears, fingers, and toes, regardless of core body insulation. The archaeological record of Neanderthal skeletons shows evidence of cold injury healed during life in some specimens, suggesting that despite their adaptations, they were not immune to the costs of extreme cold exposure. The likeliest picture given what the tools, the wear patterns, the residues, and the comparative evidence actually support, is something in the middle. Neanderthals probably draped, wrapped, and secured animal hides around their bodies in ways that provided meaningful insulation, without necessarily involving the kind of tailored, closely fitted construction that would leave no room for doubt. A large hide wrapped around the torso and held in place by a simple fastening, a smaller hide secured around the feet, coverings for the hands. These are not technically demanding to produce. They require scraped, softened hides and some means of securing them, both of which the archaeological record suggests were within Neanderthal capabilities. What they probably did not have, or at least what there is no direct evidence for, is the kind of precisely tailored, sewn outfitting that appears clearly in the record of early modern humans, tens of thousands of years later, constructed with purpose-made needles of bone and sinew thread. The distinction matters for reasons beyond technical precision. Draped hides provide good insulation but lose significant effectiveness when wet, when the wearer is moving quickly, or when wind penetrates the gaps. Fitted, sewn clothing seals against wind and retains insulation more efficiently across a wider range of conditions. This difference in performance would have had real consequences for the range and conditions under which Neanderthals could operate comfortably, and for the risk they faced during extended exposure to the worst weather. But here is the part that doesn't always get enough attention. Clothing, whatever form it took, was portable warmth, and portability changes what is possible in a landscape. A group camped at a sheltered rock shelter in winter with fire and bedding and the thermal mass of surrounding stone could maintain survivable warmth through the night with relatively minimal external covering. The challenge was everything else. The morning walk to a water source, the midday hunt across an exposed ridge, the return to camp in fading light when the temperature was dropping again. The body that was warm at the fire was not necessarily warm an hour later, upwind on a hillside waiting for an animal to come into range. Portable insulation, something worn on the body, extended the envelope of safe activity. It made longer foraging ranges possible, without proportional increases in mortality risk. It made dawn and dusk movement feasible in seasons when the temperature differential between midday and nighttime could be severe. This is why the question of Neanderthal clothing connects to so much else about their lives: their mobility, the distances they covered seasonally, the conditions under which they could hunt, the margins of safety available to smaller or younger group members who generated less body heat and had less physiological reserve. All of these things were affected by whether effective portable insulation was part of the cultural toolkit. The evidence says it was. Not in the form of a modern parka, not with the precision of later human technology, but in the form of scraped and softened hides, wrapped and secured, carried on the body as a layer of warmth that moved with the person wherever the landscape demanded they go. That was enough to matter enormously. And in a world where the margin between surviving a winter and not surviving it could be measured in degrees of temperature and hours of exposure, enough to matter was the same thing as everything. If hides were what kept a Neanderthal body alive through the cold, then stone tools were what made hides possible. They were also what made almost everything else possible. Butchering the animal, shaping the wood for a spear shaft, scraping the fat from a bone, cutting through frozen ground to reach plant material beneath. In a periglacial environment, where daylight contracted to 8 or 9 hours in the deep of winter, and the cold imposed a constant metabolic tax on everything you did, the efficiency of your tools was not a minor technical detail. It was a survival variable. A tool that required twice the effort to produce the same result as a better designed one was a tool that was costing you time, energy, and body heat you could not afford to spend. This is the frame that makes the most sense for understanding what Neanderthal toolkits were actually doing, and why the common dismissal of them as crude or unsophisticated reflects a fundamental misreading of what they were designed for. The toolmaking tradition most associated with Neanderthal is what archaeologists call the Mousterian, named after a rock shelter site in France, where these tools were first formally described in the 19th century. Mousterian assemblages appear across an enormous geographic range, from Western Europe through the Middle East and into Central Asia, and across a time span of roughly 300,000 years, though with regional variation and some overlap with other traditions. The consistency of certain core techniques across this range and across this time span says something important. These were not tools made by chance or by individuals improvising with whatever stone was nearby. They represent a stable, transmitted, deliberately learned tradition. People were teaching other people to make tools in particular ways, and those ways persisted because they worked. At the center of the Mousterian tradition is a technique that archaeologists call prepared core technology, sometimes referred to as the Levallois method in its more refined form. Understanding what this technique actually involves helps explain why it represented a genuine cognitive and practical achievement, not merely a less advanced stage on the way towards something better. The basic problem with making a sharp stone tool is that stone fractures unpredictably. Strike a raw piece of flint in the wrong place, at the wrong angle, with the wrong force, and you get a useless fragment instead of a useful flake. The solution Neanderthals developed was to prepare the core, the parent piece of stone, before attempting to remove the final usable flake. This meant carefully shaping the exterior surface of the core in advance, removing smaller preparation flakes to create a domed or facetted surface with a specific geometry. Once the core was correctly shaped, a single, precisely placed strike could detach a large, flat, sharp flake of predictable size and form. What this meant in practice was that a Neanderthal toolmaker could look at a piece of raw stone and, before touching it, mentally project the finished flake they intended to produce. The preparation work was essentially a negative space approach, shaping what would remain so that what came off would be exactly what was needed. Multiple usable flakes could be removed from a single well-prepared core, each one largely uniform, each one ready to use or to modify further with minimal additional work. The efficiency implications of this are significant. Instead of working through large quantities of raw stone to find usable pieces by trial and error, a toolmaker using prepared core techniques could extract maximum cutting edge from minimum raw material. In a landscape where good quality flint or chert was not always nearby, where winter travel was costly and carrying heavy loads of stone imposed real physical burdens, this kind of material economy was not an abstract technical virtue. It was a direct response to the practical constraints of living in a cold, resource-variable environment. Closely related to this is hafting, the attachment of a stone tool to a wooden or bone handle. Evidence for Neanderthal hafting comes from several directions. Some Neanderthal stone points show distinctive patterns of edge wear and damage consistent with having been mounted and used as spear tips rather than held directly in the hand. Chemical residue analysis of certain Mousterian tools has identified traces of plant-based adhesives, specifically birch bark tar, which must have been deliberately manufactured through a controlled heating process, not simply gathered in ready-to-use form. This is important because producing birch bark tar requires sustained, precise management of temperature, a process that has been experimentally reproduced and shown to require real attention and practice to execute correctly. What hafting accomplishes mechanically is an increase in leverage and force transmission. A spear point attached to a long shaft can be driven with far greater penetrating power than the same point held in the fist. A cutting tool fitted to a handle can be drawn across a surface with more controlled, sustained pressure than a bare flake allows. For tasks like working hides, for which we already have the wear pattern evidence discussed earlier, a hafted scraper would have been meaningfully more effective over extended use than an unhafted one, reducing hand fatigue and improving the consistency of the cut. The effort required to produce hafted tools also tells us something about planning and anticipation. You don't have to tool on a whim. The process requires the right stone tool, the right handle material, and an adhesive that has to be prepared separately. Assembling these components means thinking ahead, gathering materials before you need the finished tool, understanding the sequence of steps required and the time each will take. This is forward projection across multiple tasks, and it implies a cognitive relationship to time and preparation that is not simple. Then there is the question of what happens to tools after they are made. One of the consistent patterns in Mousterian assemblages is evidence of resharpening and maintenance. Stone cutting edges dull with use. The two ways to address this are to discard the tool and make a new one, or to rework the edge by removing additional small flakes to restore the cutting angle. The second approach requires more skill, but conserves raw material and, perhaps more importantly, conserves the time and effort already invested in producing and hafting the tool in the first place. At sites where researchers have been able to track the reduction sequence of individual tools over time, Mousterian artifacts frequently show evidence of multiple resharpening episodes, sometimes so extensive that the tool has been reduced to a small fraction of its original size before being discarded. This is not the behavior of someone working carelessly through an abundant supply of raw material. It is the behavior of someone who understands the value of what they have and is managing it deliberately, extending the useful life of each tool for as long as the material allows. In winter conditions specifically, this kind of maintenance thinking would have been especially important. Cold makes hands less dexterous. Producing a new tool from scratch in low temperatures, with stiff fingers and reduced sensitivity, carries a higher failure rate than the same task in warmer conditions. A toolkit maintained in good working order before the deep cold arrived was a toolkit that did not need to be fully rebuilt under the worst possible conditions for fine motor work. Keeping tools functional was, in this sense, a form of preparation for the season ahead. There is a persistent habit in popular accounts of Neanderthal technology to describe it as simpler than modern human technology of the same period, and to treat that simplicity as evidence of cognitive limitation. This comparison tends not to survive close examination. Mysterian tools were designed to do specific jobs efficiently in specific environments. They were not failed attempts at something more sophisticated. They were functional solutions to real problems, produced through techniques that required genuine skill, planning, and transmitted knowledge to execute correctly. The proof of this is partly in the tools themselves and partly in the record of Neanderthal survival. Populations persisting across hundreds of thousands of years in some of the most demanding environments that Ice Age Europe and Western Asia had to offer. A technology that keeps its users alive through repeated glacial cycles, across a geographic range spanning multiple continents, is not a crude technology. It is an effective one. The measure of a tool is not how closely it resembles something made later by a different species. The measure of a tool is what it allowed the people who made it to do and what it allowed them to survive. By that standard, the stone tools Neanderthals carried through the ice and the cold and the contracted winter days were doing exactly what tools are supposed to do. They were making the possible slightly larger than it would otherwise have been. And in an environment where the margin of survival was often measured in very small increments, slightly larger was enough. The tools were made in order to do something with them, and for Neanderthals living through glacial and interglacial cycles across Europe and Western Asia, that something was, more often than not, the acquisition of large, dangerous, calorie-dense animals in landscapes where every season placed different constraints on where prey could be found, how it moved, and how it could be approached. This is where the popular image of Neanderthal hunting tends to generate the most distortion. The familiar version of the story has them charging straight at mammoth or woolly rhinoceros with short thrusting spears, relying on physical strength rather than planning, getting injured constantly, and surviving largely through luck and scavenging. The actual archaeological record suggests something more considered, more varied, and considerably more competent. The first thing to understand is that there was no single Neanderthal diet, because there was no single Neanderthal environment. Across roughly 300,000 years of occupation in Europe and Western Asia, Neanderthal populations encountered conditions ranging from open steppe tundra with permafrost within a few feet of the surface to forested interglacial landscapes warm enough to support straight-tusked elephants and hippos in what is now Britain. The animals available, and therefore the hunting strategies that made sense, shifted substantially with these climate phases. During colder, more glaciated periods, the dominant large prey species in much of Europe were reindeer and horse, with bison, woolly rhinoceros, and woolly mammoth appearing less frequently in the faunal assemblages at most sites, but present enough to have been engaged with regularly. In more temperate intervals, red deer, aurochs, and various woodland species replaced the steppe fauna as primary targets. Regional variation added another layer. Neanderthal groups in coastal areas had access to marine resources. Those in more mountainous terrain encountered ibex and chamois, animals that behave very differently from open-ground grazers and require correspondingly different approaches. What the zooarchaeological evidence shows when you look across this range of sites and time periods is a consistent pattern of focused hunting on a relatively small number of prey species at any given location, sites dominated by reindeer bone show reindeer at every level of representation, not as a minor component of a broadly diverse diet, but as the primary target, repeatedly and over extended periods. This is called prey specialization, and it implies knowledge. You do not specialize in a particular animal without understanding its movement patterns, its seasonal behavior, its preferred terrain, its reactions to disturbance. Prey specialization is the signature of hunters who are paying close attention over long periods of time and building that attention into something transferable. shared knowledge about where reindeer would be in late autumn, how far they moved between summer and winter ranges, which valley crossings they used predictably enough to be worth waiting at. The question of how Neanderthals actually made the kill is harder to answer from the bones alone, but several lines of evidence converge on a plausible picture. Their spears, insofar as we can reconstruct them, were weighted and balanced for thrusting rather than throwing, though this remains debated. The Schöningen spears from Germany, dated to around 300,000 years ago, and attributable to Neanderthal ancestors if not Neanderthals proper, are the oldest complete wooden spears recovered anywhere. They are front-heavy, like modern javelins, which argues against the simple thrusting-only model. Some researchers have argued these could have been thrown over short distances, and experimental work has supported the idea that they could be effective at ranges of up to 30 or 40 meters in the hands of a practiced thrower. The debate is not fully resolved, but the thrusting spear at close range is probably not the whole story. What close-range engagement does appear in the record is the context of ambush hunting. In terrain that restricted animal movement, caves and rock shelters were often situated at points where topography funneled prey, narrow valleys, river crossings, cliff edges where animals could be pressed into positions from which escape was difficult. The spatial distribution of kill sites relative to landscape features suggests that Neanderthals were selecting hunting locations based on the kind of geographical advantage that reduces the distance at which contact with prey was required. This is not reckless charging, it is patience, positioning, and an understanding of how terrain shapes animal behavior. Cooperative tactics are harder to demonstrate directly from the archaeological record, but the skeletal evidence of the prey itself gives indirect support. Accumulations of horse bones at certain sites include animals of multiple ages and sizes, patterns consistent with mass-killing events, rather than the sequential accumulation of individual kills over long periods. Driving groups of animals into natural traps, over embankments, or into boggy ground where they became immobilized is a technique documented among historically observed hunter-gatherer groups worldwide, and the site patterns are at least consistent with this approach having been used by Neanderthals as well. Coordinating a drive requires communication, role differentiation, and the ability to execute a plan that depends on multiple individuals behaving in a specific sequence. Whether Neanderthals were doing this in anything like the organized way that modern human hunters have been observed to do it is not something the bones can confirm with certainty. But the bones do not contradict it either. The butchery evidence is where the record becomes most directly readable. Cut marks on animal bones provide a detailed record of what happened after an animal was killed, and what the cut marks show is systematic, knowledgeable processing. The locations of cut marks on deer and horse bones from Neanderthal sites correspond precisely to the major muscle attachments, the places where a knowledgeable butcher would work to strip the maximum meat from a carcass as efficiently as possible. This is not random hacking. It reflects anatomical knowledge applied consistently across multiple animals at multiple sites over long periods of time. Fracture patterns on long bones tell a related story. The spiral fractures that indicate intentional breaking of fresh bone to extract marrow are common in Neanderthal faunal assemblages, and they appear on bones from which the surrounding meat had already been thoroughly removed. This suggests a processing sequence, flesh first, then marrow, the kind of ordered approach that extracts maximum caloric value from each animal. Marrow is calorically dense and requires no cooking to be digestible, though cooking it would have improved both flavour and yield. In a landscape where a single large kill might represent a significant portion of a group's caloric intake for days or weeks, the difference between thorough and incomplete carcass processing was not trivial. Transport decisions visible in the bone assemblages add another layer of evidence for planning. At some Neanderthal sites, the animal bones present are not a representative sample of the whole skeleton. Certain elements are consistently overrepresented, others consistently absent. This is the signature of selective transport. Hunters who killed animals at some distance from their shelter carried back the most calorie-rich portions, leaving behind the lower-value skeletal elements. The decisions embedded in this pattern require mental accounting. You're weighing the energy cost of carrying a heavy limb bone against the caloric return of the marrow inside it, and making that calculation before you walk back to camp. This is not scavenging. Scavengers take what they find. This is prioritization at the point of a kill by hunters who already knew what they were going to do with what they had. The skeletal trauma record among Neanderthal individuals themselves is the source of the persistent idea that their hunting was unusually dangerous. Neanderthal skeletons do show high rates of healed injuries, particularly to the upper body, head, and neck. One analysis found that the injury distribution in a sample of Neanderthal remains closely resembled that of modern rodeo riders, a pattern consistent with repeated close-range contact with large, forceful animals. This tells us that hunting involved genuine physical risk, and that those injuries were not always fatal, which in turn tells us something about social care. A healed injury is evidence of survival, and survival through a serious wound implies that someone was providing food and protection during the recovery period. What the trauma record cannot tell us is whether this injury rate reflects recklessness, or simply the irreducible danger of hunting large ungulates and megafauna with handheld weapons in a world without emergency medicine. Modern indigenous hunters who use spears and pursue dangerous animals also sustain injuries. The comparison is imperfect in many ways, but it reminds us that the presence of healed trauma does not by itself indicate poor hunting technique. It indicates that the work was genuinely dangerous, and that Neanderthal groups had the social capacity to support injured individuals through recovery. The scavenging hypothesis, the idea that Neanderthals were primarily dependent on the abandoned kills of other predators rather than being hunters in their own right, does not survive serious contact with the evidence. The prey specialization patterns, the systematic butchery traces, the selective transport decisions, the site locations relative to favorable ambush terrain, and the presence of weapons capable of delivering lethal force all point in the same direction. Neanderthals were hunters, organized enough to pursue particular prey systematically, knowledgeable enough to process what they killed thoroughly, and strategic enough to choose where and when to engage in ways that improved their odds in a landscape where getting it wrong had immediate and irreversible consequences. The hunting record is compelling, and it has dominated how we think about Neanderthal subsistence for the better part of a century. But it has also distorted the picture in a particular direction, because bones preserve and plant matter largely does not. What archaeologists found most abundantly in the earliest excavations was what the animals had left behind: teeth, ribs, skulls, the durable remnants of large mammal prey. From that skewed sample came a skewed conclusion: the idea that Neanderthals were essentially obligate carnivores, Ice Age meat specialists who lived and died by the hunt, and had little use for anything that grew out of the ground. That picture has been quietly dismantled over the past few decades by methods that did not exist when the original characterizations were made. Two of the most productive tools have been isotope analysis and dental calculus, and it is worth understanding what each can and cannot tell us. Stable isotope analysis works by examining the ratio of certain nitrogen isotopes preserved in collagen from Neanderthal bones. Because nitrogen isotopes shift predictably as you move up the food chain, high nitrogen-15 values indicate a diet with a substantial animal protein component. Neanderthal bones from sites across Europe have consistently returned high nitrogen-15 values, values comparable to those of large carnivores like wolves and hyenas from the same deposits. This is genuine evidence for a diet heavily weighted toward animal protein, and it should not be minimized. In cold northern environments with long winters and limited plant productivity, that weighting makes ecological sense. But isotope values from bone collagen reflect protein intake specifically, not total caloric intake, and they are biased toward the signals that dominate over the years during which collagen is being laid down. A diet that included substantial plant carbohydrates alongside animal protein would not necessarily look different in bone collagen from one that was almost entirely meat, because carbohydrates do not register strongly in the nitrogen signal. The isotopes tell us Neanderthals were eating a lot of animal protein. They do not tell us that plant foods were absent or negligible. Dental calculus tells a different story, and in some ways a more granular one. Calculus is the mineralized plaque that forms on teeth and can trap microscopic particles of whatever passed through a person's mouth. It is not selectively preserved in the way that bone is. It simply accumulates, hardens, and survives burial alongside the teeth it formed on. When researchers began analyzing Neanderthal dental calculus with modern microscopy and biochemical techniques, they started finding things that the bone record had given no hint of. At Shanidar Cave in what is now northern Iraq, calculus analysis has revealed starch granules from wild grasses and legumes. At El Sidron in northern Spain, the calculus from several Neanderthal individuals contained evidence of bitter-tasting plants, including yarrow, groundsel, and something consistent with woody nightshade, plants with no significant caloric value that may have been used medicinally or simply chewed and expectorated. At Spy Cave in Belgium, dental calculus preserved evidence of starchy plant consumption, alongside woolly rhinoceros and wild sheep. The plant signatures vary by region and likely by season, which is exactly what you would expect from foragers who were opportunistically exploiting whatever was locally available, alongside their primary large-game hunting. The starch evidence in particular is worth pausing on. Underground storage organs, which is the unglamorous collective term for the tubers, corms, bulbs and rhizomes that various plants use to stockpile energy through the winter, are among the most calorie-dense plant foods available to a forager in a temperate or cool environment. They are also available at times of year when above-ground plant matter has died back and fruiting has long since finished. A Neanderthal group with the knowledge to locate and process underground storage organs would have had access to a reliable storable carbohydrate source during the shoulder seasons, when large prey was not always within reach, and the lean months of late winter had not yet given way to spring. Whether Neanderthals were systematically exploiting these resources is something the calculus and microbotanical evidence can suggest but not confirm with precision. The signatures are present. The scale of exploitation is harder to quantify. Nuts represent another category of plant food where the evidence is circumstantial but ecologically plausible. Across the interglacial periods when European Neanderthals were living in warmer, more forested environments, the availability of hazelnuts, acorns, and similar high-fat storable seeds would have been substantial. Hazelnut shells preserve reasonably well archaeologically, and they appear at some Neanderthal-associated sites, though attribution is always complicated by the presence of other species that also collect nuts. The ecological logic is harder to dismiss than any single site finding. A group of intelligent, food-seeking hominins living in a late interglacial forest in Western Europe, surrounded by hazel thickets and oak woodland, and not eating the nuts would be a stranger finding than one that did. The evidence for small game, birds, fish, and coastal resources is patchier but growing. For a long time, the inability to catch fast-moving small animals was used as a cognitive benchmark, a way of distinguishing the supposedly reactive, opportunistic Neanderthal from the supposedly strategic, flexible modern human. That framing has weakened considerably. Rabbit bones with cut marks appear at Neanderthal sites in Spain, in quantities that suggest deliberate and repeated harvesting rather than incidental acquisition. Bird bones with butchery marks have been recovered from sites across southern Europe, and in some cases the species involved are raptors and corvids, whose feathers may have been as valuable as their flesh, perhaps used for ornamentation or insulation. Whether feather use for decoration reflects symbolic thinking is a separate question, but the processing itself is clear. Coastal Neanderthals, particularly those living along the southern Iberian coast during periods when sea level and climate made those environments productive, appear to have been exploiting marine resources with some regularity. Shellfish remains occur at sites like Bayondillo and Cueva de los Aviones in Spain, and the evidence suggests collection rather than accidental ingestion. Isotope data from coastal Neanderthal specimens shows marine protein signatures, a distinct signal that can only come from consistent consumption of seafood. Fish bones are more fragile and harder to recover archaeologically, so their relative scarcity in the record may reflect preservation bias more than behavioral reality. The shellfish evidence does not require sophisticated technology to explain. It requires knowledge of tidal patterns, shoreline habitat, and the seasonal availability of different shellfish species. That knowledge, like the knowledge of reindeer movement routes or the location of good flint outcrops, is the kind of thing that accumulates within groups and gets transmitted across generations. Cooking deserves attention here because it sits at the intersection of diet and technology in ways that are easy to overlook. There is substantial evidence that Neanderthals were deliberately cooking food, not just warming it incidentally near fires, but subjecting it to enough heat to change its structure. Burnt bone with patterns consistent with roasting rather than accidental exposure appears at many sites. Starch granules in dental calculus sometimes show the gelatinization signatures of having been heated before consumption. This matters for diet more than it might initially seem. Cooking substantially increases the digestible energy available from both animal and plant foods. Cooked starch is more efficiently metabolized than raw starch. Cooked protein is easier to access than raw protein. cooked tubers that would be nearly inedible or outright unpleasant raw become palatable and energy-rich. The Neanderthal groups that were cooking their food regularly were extracting more from whatever they found than groups that were not, and the dental calculus evidence suggests that cooking plant foods was not an occasional or accidental practice. What emerges from all of this is a dietary picture that is genuinely varied, regionally differentiated, and seasonally structured. Neanderthals in northern Europe during glacial periods were probably eating a diet dominated by large mammal protein and fat, because that is what their environments most reliably offered. Neanderthals in warmer, more vegetated environments during interglacial phases likely incorporated more plant foods, small game, and diverse resources. Coastal populations had access to marine calories that inland groups never encountered. The idea of a single Neanderthal diet, like the idea of a single Neanderthal environment or a single Neanderthal toolkit, turns out to be a simplification that the evidence does not support. The carnivore caricature persisted partly because of what survives, and partly because of what early researchers were looking for. When you excavate a cave floor and find 10,000 horse teeth and a scatter of flint flakes, the story of hunters and large prey writes itself. When the starch granules in a fragment of calculus on a molar require a mass spectrometer and a specialist to interpret, that story takes longer to reach the public. The isotopes were real, the hunting was real, and so were the tubers, the hazelnuts, the shellfish, and whatever bitter plant someone at El Cedron was chewing on during an interglacial afternoon, for reasons we can only partially guess at now. The dietary picture that emerges from the evidence is not the portrait of a lone scavenger working the margins of some larger predator's kill. It is a picture of informed, flexible foragers, drawing on accumulated knowledge about landscapes, seasons, and resources. And that kind of knowledge does not exist in a single mind. It lives in groups, it travels between people, it survives because someone took the time to pass it on. The solitary, brutish Neanderthal, the stooped figure grunting over a raw carcass with no apparent interest in the others of its kind, was never really an archaeological finding. It was an inference, one that reflected more about the assumptions researchers brought to the evidence than about anything the bones and stones were actually saying. The physical robustness of the Neanderthal skeleton, that enormous bone density and powerful musculature, was read as a kind of compensatory substitute for intelligence, as though brute strength and social sophistication were inversely related. The anatomy said something real about a body adapted to intense physical demands in cold environments. The social interpretation layered on top of it was largely unfounded, and it has not held up well. Cold environments do not favour solitary living, they punish it. In warm, resource-rich settings, a sufficiently capable individual might survive alone for stretches of time, foraging across a productive landscape and sheltering without assistance. In the environments Neanderthals were actually occupying, the calculus is different. Winter in glacial Europe was a season that demanded food stores, maintained fire, shared warmth, and distributed labour in ways that a single individual, or even a single nuclear family, could not reliably sustain alone. The cold is not an abstraction here. It is an active pressure that selects, over generations, for behavioural strategies that work. And what works in the cold, what the historical and ethnographic record of northern foraging peoples demonstrates with remarkable consistency, is cooperation. Food sharing is one of the clearest markers of that cooperation, and it leaves traces in the skeleton in ways that require careful interpretation but that are nonetheless real. Large prey animals, the horses and reindeer and woolly mammoths, whose bones fill Neanderthal sites, produce far more food at once than a single individual or couple with dependent young could consume before spoilage. The logic of sharing that surplus with others and receiving a share when others make a kill is straightforward enough that it barely needs stating. But the skeletal evidence suggests something beyond simple opportunistic sharing. Isotope profiles from individuals at the same site sometimes show dietary variation that implies different roles or access patterns within the group, subtle signals of a social structure in which food moved between people in organised rather than random ways. The interpretation requires caution, and no single site's isotope data can carry more weight than the method allows. But the ecological argument for structured food sharing among cold-weather foragers is strong independently of any particular specimen. Childcare is another dimension where the ecological logic presses hard. Neanderthal infants, like all hominin infants, were born helpless and remained dependent for years. The physical demands of Neanderthal foraging, which included closing in on dangerous large prey, managing heavy stone tools, and moving across difficult terrain in cold weather, were not compatible with carrying and nursing an infant simultaneously. In human foraging societies, the care of young children involves a network of individuals beyond the biological mother, grandmothers and aunts, older siblings, and other group members who watch, carry and feed dependent young while primary foragers are working. The evidence for this in the Neanderthal record is indirect, but the alternative, that Neanderthal mothers managed infants entirely alone while also hunting, butchering, foraging and maintaining fire, does not cohere with what we know about the physical realities of their lives. The evidence for care of injured and disabled individuals is among the most discussed aspects of Neanderthal social life, and it deserves both the attention it has received and some tempering of the stronger claims sometimes made about it. The Shanidar 1 individual from Iraqi Kurdistan is the most cited case. This was a male who survived to what was probably middle age, a substantial lifespan for a Neanderthal, despite injuries that included a healed crushing fracture to one side of the skull, a withered and likely useless right arm and possible loss of vision in one eye. The survival of this individual to an age where the injuries had clearly long since healed implies that he was not abandoned or excluded from the group at the point of injury or disability. Whether this constitutes active care in any emotionally resonant sense, whether others brought him food, tended his wounds, supported him through recovery, is something the skeleton cannot confirm. What it confirms is survival under conditions where a fully incapacitated individual would not have survived alone. Similar cases appear across the Neanderthal record. Older individuals with severe dental wear, arthritic joints, and healed traumatic injuries who lived on past the point where they could have been fully contributing to subsistence activities. The cautious interpretation is that these individuals were tolerated and probably fed by others when they could not feed themselves, a form of social buffering against individual misfortune that is well documented in living primate societies and nearly universal in human foraging groups. The stronger interpretation, that Neanderthals felt something like compassion or social obligation toward injured and elderly group members, may well be true. It is simply not something the bones alone can establish. The behavior is real. The motivation behind it remains a matter of inference. Group size and its effect on resilience is worth thinking about carefully, because the relationship is not linear. Very small groups, bands of fewer than 10 or 15 individuals, are efficient in some ways but catastrophically vulnerable in others. A single death during a difficult winter, a primary hunter lost to injury, a nursing mother lost to illness, can destabilize a group that's small beyond recovery. Larger groups buffer against individual loss, but require larger territories and more complex coordination to feed. The evidence from Neanderthal sites suggests groups that were probably in the range of 10 to 30 individuals as a working unit, likely with ties to neighbouring groups through kinship and occasional aggregation during more productive seasons. Stone tool, raw materials recovered from Neanderthal sites, sometimes originate from sources tens or even hundreds of kilometres away, evidence that Neanderthal groups were not isolated from one another, but were embedded in networks of contact across which materials, and presumably people and knowledge, moved. Those knowledge networks are the part of Neanderthal social life that is most invisible archaeologically, and probably most important to survival. The toolmaking traditions we see in the Mousterian and related industries required substantial skill to execute. Producing a well-shaped Levallois flake, for instance, demands an understanding of stone mechanics, three-dimensional planning, and controlled force application that does not come from watching once or twice. It comes from practice under guidance. Someone had to teach it, and that means someone took the time to demonstrate, to correct, to pass on accumulated understanding about which stones are worth carrying, and which will fracture unpredictably, about the angle of the platform and the direction of the blow. That teaching is a social act. It requires patience, attention to another individual's learning, and some model of what the learner needs to understand in order to succeed. The transmission of ecological knowledge follows the same logic. Knowing where water is reliable in late summer, which valley holds bison during the autumn rut, where flint outcrops of good quality can be found 2 days' travel to the north, which plants ease a stomach cramp or reduce an infected wound's swelling. None of this is reinvented by each generation from scratch. It accumulates. It gets told, demonstrated, refined, and passed on. In a group where the oldest members have lived through 3 or 4 decades of the landscape's seasonal rhythms, Their knowledge is not merely biographical, it is a survival resource for everyone younger. The healed, disabled, older individuals whose bones appear at Neanderthal sites were not just recipients of care. They were likely among the primary holders of that accumulated knowledge, and their survival into old age was a form of investment in the group's long-term competence. What the evidence adds up to is not a picture of warmth and tenderness in some sentimental register, but something more austere and perhaps more impressive. Cold, difficult environments, large and dangerous prey, long winters with uncertain food supplies, these conditions shaped Neanderthal social life just as surely as they shaped Neanderthal bodies. The result was not brutishness. It was mutual dependence of a kind that left traces in healed bones and shared tool styles and raw materials carried across mountain ranges. They survived not despite their social lives, but because of them, because knowledge moved between people, because losses were absorbed by the group rather than borne alone, and because the skills required to live through an Ice Age winter were too complex and too hard-won to be discovered individually in each generation. That is not a small thing. That may have been the most essential technology they had. The knowledge that allowed Neanderthals to survive a winter did not operate only within a single cave or a single valley. It operated across a landscape, and that landscape had to be read, remembered, and moved through in ways that were neither random nor rigid. Understanding Neanderthal mobility means setting aside two images that have each distorted the picture in opposite directions. The first is the image of a sedentary Neanderthal, a creature huddled in one cave year after year, venturing out only when hunger became unbearable, returning always to the same dark alcove as though incapable of conceiving any other option. The second is the image of an aimless wanderer, drifting across the landscape without plan or memory, following prey opportunistically and leaving sites when resources gave out, carrying no map of the world in mind because no such map existed. Neither of these has survived sustained contact with the evidence. What the evidence suggests instead is something considerably more sophisticated and considerably more recognizable. The primary tools for reconstructing Neanderthal movement patterns are indirect but informative. Stone is perhaps the most useful. Different rock formations produce different tool quality materials, and those materials have chemical and structural signatures that allow archaeologists to trace where a given piece of flint or chert or quartzite was originally sourced. What this analysis consistently finds is that stone at Neanderthal occupation sites was not always local. Raw materials from sources tens of kilometers away appear regularly. Materials from sources more than 100 kilometers distant appear often enough to be considered a normal feature of the archaeological record rather than an anomaly. This means Neanderthal groups were moving across substantial ranges, or were receiving materials through exchange with other groups, or both. Either interpretation carries significant implications for how we understand their relationship to the landscape. They were not confined to a single drainage or a single mountain massif. They were embedded in territories large enough to encompass multiple ecological zones, and they were in contact directly or indirectly with other groups whose ranges extended the network further. Animal seasonality provides a second line of evidence. Many Neanderthal sites show concentrations of bones from animals that behave in strongly seasonal ways. Reindeer migrate. Horses move between lowland winter ranges and highland summer pastures. Red deer follow altitudinal gradients with the seasons. When an archaeological site contains the bones of animals killed at a particular season, determined through growth ring analysis in teeth or through the developmental stage of juveniles, it tells you something about when that site was occupied. The pattern that emerges across many Neanderthal sites is consistent with what anthropologists call a seasonal round, a structured annual cycle of movement between locations chosen to intercept specific resources at the times of year when those resources are most accessible and most abundant. Spring might bring movement toward calving grounds where large prey were vulnerable. Summer offered highland pastures with grazing herds and a wider range of plant foods. Autumn hunting of animals fattened on summer vegetation provided the caloric stores needed to survive winter. Winter itself likely meant a retreat to more sheltered locations, often in river valleys or near cave systems that offered protection from the coldest exposure. This was not improvisation. A seasonal round of this kind requires detailed knowledge of the landscape accumulated over years, probably over generations. It requires knowing not just where the herds go, but when, and what the early signs are that movement is imminent. It requires knowing which routes between locations are passable in which seasons, where water is reliable and where it is seasonal, which valley offers the best shelter when a storm system arrives from the northwest. That knowledge does not exist in a single mind in isolation. It is built up collaboratively, tested against experience, and transmitted to younger members of the group who will eventually carry it forward. The oldest members of the group, those individuals whose healed injuries and worn teeth suggest decades of experience, were likely the primary holders of this landscape knowledge, and their presence in the group was in part a practical geographic resource. The management of toolkits during movement deserves attention because it reflects a kind of logistical thinking that is easy to overlook. Neanderthals were not making tools casually and discarding them whenever they moved. The evidence from site assemblages suggests careful management of stone resources, including the transport of partially worked cores that could be further reduced as needed, and the maintenance and resharpening of tools rather than their replacement. When quality stone was available, Neanderthals appear to have acquired it in larger quantities than immediate need required, suggesting anticipatory provisioning, the recognition that good raw material would not always be within reach, and that carrying a reserve made future situations more manageable. Some researchers have suggested evidence for caching, the deliberate storage of resources at known locations for retrieval later, though the archaeological signature of caching is difficult to distinguish from other depositional patterns. What is clear is that the movement across landscapes was not accompanied by the casual abandonment of tool investment. The toolkits travelled with the group and were managed as valued resources across the arc of a seasonal journey. Routes were not chosen arbitrarily. River valleys and their associated corridors offered multiple advantages simultaneously. They provided reliable water. They concentrated animal movement, since prey followed water sources, and valley floors were often more easily traversed than broken upland terrain. They offered raw material exposures in stream gravels and cut banks. They provided shelter from wind in low-lying bends and tributary junctions. The distribution of Neanderthal sites across European and Western Asian landscapes reflects this logic repeatedly, with concentrations along major river systems, at valley confluences, and at topographic choke points where movement between different landscape zones was naturally funneled through predictable passes and crossings. Reading those distributions is reading something about Neanderthal geographic thinking, the implicit knowledge of landscape structure that shaped every route decision. Extreme events complicated this logic in ways that required rapid and sometimes difficult responses. The paleoclimate record from this period is not a smooth curve. It is punctuated by episodes of abrupt change, sudden coolings, volcanic events that reduced solar input and disrupted growing seasons, drought pulses that collapsed prey populations in specific regions. When a local resource base failed suddenly, the options available to a Neanderthal group were not many. They could remain and attempt to subsist on diminishing resources, which carried obvious risks. They could attempt to move into territories occupied by neighbouring groups, which introduced its own complexities around competition and negotiation. Or they could push into unfamiliar territory, navigating by whatever general geographic knowledge they held, seeking conditions that might support survival until a return became viable. The archaeological record suggests that Neanderthal population distribution was not static. There are periods and regions where site density drops sharply, likely reflecting local contractions and extinctions of individual groups during difficult climate phases. These local losses were presumably followed, when conditions recovered, by recolonization from groups whose ranges had overlapped or abutted the affected area. The meta-population logic that allowed Neanderthals to persist as a whole, even while individual groups rose and fell, depended on exactly this kind of regional mobility. What the evidence does not support is the idea that these movements were disorganized or reactive in the simplest sense. The recurrence of specific sites over long time periods, some Neanderthal cave and rock shelter sites, show repeated occupation across tens of thousands of years, suggests that particular locations held remembered value and were returned to as part of a deliberate cycle rather than rediscovered accidentally on each visit. A group that knows a certain south-facing shelter above a river bend is reliably accessible in early winter, that the spring at the base of the limestone outcrop 2 valleys east runs even in dry years, that the river crossing at the wide gravel bar is passable in late summer, but not in snowmelt season, is a group operating with a mental geography of the landscape that constitutes genuine navigational knowledge. That knowledge had to be taught, maintained, and updated across generations. It was a form of cultural inheritance as surely as tool-making technique or the methods of processing a hide. Neanderthal mobility, understood this way, was neither confinement nor aimlessness. It was the structured, seasonally organized, logistically considered movement of people who knew their landscapes with a depth of familiarity that comes only from long experience and careful attention. They were not wandering. They were following a route they had inherited, adjusting it as conditions required, carrying with them both the material toolkit and the geographic memory that made the next camp possible. The land was not unfamiliar ground through which they moved uncertainly. It was something closer to home, understood across all its seasonal moods, and navigated with the quiet competence of people who had survived there before. That structured knowledge of the landscape, that careful seasonal intelligence built across generations, was not being tested against a stable world. The world itself kept changing. Not slowly, not predictably, not in ways that gave populations centuries to adjust. Sometimes the change came faster than that, fast enough that a single human lifetime could encompass conditions that bore little resemblance to what a person had learned in childhood. Understanding how Neanderthals persisted through their entire span of existence requires sitting with that reality for a moment, because the popular image of Neanderthal life tends to flatten several 100,000 years into a single frozen tableau, as though the Ice Age were one long consistent condition that eventually ended. It was not anything like that. The paleoclimate record contains what researchers call Dansgaard-Oeschger events, named for the scientists whose work helped identify them in ice cores drilled from Greenland. These are episodes of abrupt climate shift, and the word abrupt here carries real weight. A warming event of 10 degrees Celsius averaged across a hemisphere, which is an enormous change by any measure, could unfold over decades rather than millennia. In terms that matter for a living population, this means a grandmother and her grandchildren might have experienced genuinely different worlds, without either of them moving more than a day's walk from where they were born. The vegetation changes, the prey changes, the rivers change their seasonal behavior, the snow accumulates differently, or fails to accumulate at all, in places where it had always been reliable. The cold stadials and warmer interstadials did not alternate on a human-friendly schedule. They followed their own logic, driven by ocean circulation patterns and atmospheric dynamics that had no interest in whether a Neanderthal band had just established a reliable seasonal route through a particular valley. Over the span of Neanderthal existence, which stretched across something in the range of 300,000 to 400,000 years, dozens of these oscillations occurred. Each one reshaped the distribution of habitable zones across Europe and Western Asia. During colder phases, the open steppe tundra expanded southward, pushing treeline lower, contracting forests into fragmented patches, and altering the distribution of the large herbivores that formed the core of the Neanderthal diet. During warmer phases, forest advanced northward again, dense woodland replacing the open landscapes that supported certain prey species, while creating new opportunities for others. Neither condition was necessarily fatal in itself. Neanderthals demonstrably lived through both, but the transitions between them compressed entire ecological reorganizations into periods that were short on geological timescales and potentially devastating on human ones. The refugia concept helps make sense of how populations could have persisted through the harshest phases. A refugium, in the ecological sense, is a location where local conditions remain viable, even when the surrounding region has become inhospitable. During severe cold phases in Europe, certain areas offered relative shelter. The Iberian Peninsula, portions of southern France, the Caucasus region, areas of the Italian peninsula, and parts of the Levant may have functioned as population refugia, where Neanderthal groups maintained themselves while populations further north were extinguished or severely reduced. The key word is may. The evidence is suggestive rather than definitive. Site density in these regions during cold phases is higher than elsewhere, and genetic analysis of later Neanderthal populations shows patterns consistent with periodic isolation and reconnection that would follow from refugial dynamics. But archaeology cannot directly observe a refugium functioning. It can only observe where occupation evidence concentrates and where it thins, and then build interpretations carefully around that pattern. The relationship between changing vegetation and everything else in Neanderthal life cannot be overstated. Plants are the base of the food web. When vegetation shifted, prey distribution shifted accordingly. Reindeer and horse, which thrive in open steppe conditions, became more abundant and more accessible during cold phases when those landscapes dominated. Forest-dependent species like red deer and aurochs pulled back toward refugial woodland. The fuel available for fire changed with the tree line. In heavily glaciated or open tundra conditions, wood was scarce, and there is evidence from some sites of Neanderthals burning bone as a fuel supplement when wood was unavailable, a pragmatic solution to a specific scarcity that tells us something about their capacity to adapt means to circumstance. Travel corridors opened and closed as river systems changed their courses, as ice sheets advanced to block certain passes and retreated to open others, as the coastlines of Europe shifted considerably with the rise and fall of sea levels tied to glacial cycles. The archaeological signal of these disruptions is there, though it requires careful reading and a certain resistance to overinterpretation. During some periods and in some regions, the density of Neanderthal occupation sites drops sharply. Tools become scarcer, hearths fewer, faunal assemblages thinner. This could reflect regional extinction of local populations. It could reflect contraction into a smaller number of occupied sites, rather than genuine depopulation. It could reflect preservation bias, with some site types being more archaeologically visible than others. Probably it reflects some combination of all three, varying by region and time period. What seems reasonably well supported is that Neanderthal population distribution was dynamic rather than static, with phases of expansion into northern and eastern ranges during warmer interstadials, and contraction towards southern refugial zones during colder stadials. Individual groups rose and failed. Territories went unoccupied for generations, and were then recolonized when conditions permitted. The overall persistence of the Neanderthal lineage across hundreds of thousands of years was not the persistence of a single continuous network, but of something more like the metapopulation structure described earlier, a pattern of loss and recovery and recolonization that left the whole intact even while its parts were repeatedly lost and replaced. One particular myth deserves direct attention here, because it shapes popular understanding in ways that the evidence simply does not support. The idea that a single severe cold phase explains what happened to Neanderthals, that they were fundamentally cold-adapted creatures who thrived until one especially brutal winter or one especially prolonged glacial maximum finally overwhelmed them, misrepresents both their history and their ultimate disappearance. Neanderthals had already survived dozens of severe climate phases before the period of their final disappearance. The cold was not new to them. Their bodies, their technologies, their social strategies, and their accumulated landscape knowledge were all calibrated to cold environments in ways that modern humans arriving from Africa were not. If cold alone were sufficient to explain Neanderthal decline, the problem runs in entirely the wrong direction. It would be the newcomers who should have struggled. Their disappearance, concentrated roughly between 45 and 40,000 years ago, coincides with the arrival and expansion of Homo sapiens in Europe, and the more carefully researchers examine that period, the more complicated and multi-stranded the picture becomes. But that belongs to the next part of this story. What is relevant here is that the centuries before that final period show Neanderthals doing what they had always done, responding to climate fluctuation by contracting, shifting, persisting in refugia, and re-expanding when conditions allowed. The archaeological record of the last Neanderthal populations is not primarily a record of climate-stressed collapse. It is a record of people who were still moving, still hunting, still maintaining toolkits, still occupying the kinds of sites their ancestors had occupied for hundreds of thousands of years. Whatever ultimately ended their independent existence was not simply the cold returning one more time. The climate oscillations that Neanderthals navigated across their long history were genuinely extreme by any reasonable measure. The capacity to persist through them was not a matter of passive endurance, but of active management, the careful application of accumulated knowledge about where populations could hold on when local conditions worsened, which routes reconnected refugia when conditions improved, how to shift diet and fuel strategy as the vegetation around them rearranged itself on timescales of decades. None of that was simple, none of it was automatic. It was learned, and it was taught, and it was tested repeatedly against a world that offered no guarantees. That Neanderthals continued to exist for as long as they did is itself a form of evidence about the depth of that knowledge and the resilience of the social structures that preserved and transmitted it. The abrupt swings did not find them unprepared. They found a people who had been prepared by the experience of surviving the last one. The arrival of Homo sapiens in Europe was not a single event. That point is worth establishing carefully before anything else, because the popular version of this story tends to compress it into something almost cinematic, a wave of anatomically modern humans cresting over a horizon and washing across a continent whose Neanderthal inhabitants then vanished. The archaeological and genetic evidence suggests something considerably more drawn out, more regionally varied, and more difficult to summarize cleanly. The earliest secure evidence for Homo sapiens in Europe dates to somewhere around 45,000 years ago, though there are scattered finds that may push that boundary somewhat earlier, and the interpretation of the most ambiguous specimens remains contested. What this means in practical terms is that there was a period of several thousand years, possibly longer in some regions, during which both populations occupied the same broad continental range. Whether the overlap translated into direct contact depended enormously on where and when you were standing. Europe is not a uniform landscape. The Iberian Peninsula, the Italian Peninsula, the Levant, the corridor through the Balkans, the Rhine Valley, the southern margins of the steppe, all of these regions had their own occupation histories and their own timing. Two populations sharing a continent does not mean any two groups within those populations ever encountered each other at all. The Levant is actually where the earliest potential contact zones appear, well before the sapiens' expansion into Europe proper. There are sites in what is now Israel where Neanderthal and early modern human occupation layers are stacked above one another in the same caves, separated by sediment that represents thousands of years. Mount Carmel sites like Taban and Skul and Kafsi show this kind of alternating presence, with modern human remains dating to roughly 90,000 to 120,000 years ago, and Neanderthal remains appearing in other layers. These populations were not necessarily interacting directly. They may have been using the same locations at different times, pulled there by the same geographic logic of shelter and water and prey, without ever occupying those places simultaneously. The sediment between their layers sometimes represents gaps long enough that calling it a meeting would be generous. And yet the genetic evidence tells us that meetings did happen. Every person alive today whose ancestry traces outside of sub-Saharan Africa carries a small but measurable proportion of Neanderthal DNA, typically somewhere between 1 and 4% depending on the population. This is not a trace amount that could result from contamination or statistical noise. It is a real signal of genuine interbreeding, and it appears to have happened primarily in a relatively concentrated window of time, with estimates clustering around the period of early sapiens expansion out of Africa. The most parsimonious interpretation is that as modern humans moved through the Levant and into Western Asia on their way toward Europe, they encountered Neanderthal populations and on some occasions, in some places, produced offspring that survived and reproduced. That the genes persist into the present means those hybrid individuals were not isolated exceptions. They were integrated into communities. They had children. Their descendants carried the mixed ancestry forward. What this does not tell us is the emotional register of those encounters, whether they were predominantly peaceful or predominantly hostile, whether exchange happened through trade or through raiding, whether individuals moved between groups voluntarily or otherwise. These questions are genuinely open, and honesty requires saying so rather than filling the silence with speculation dressed up as reconstruction. What the archaeological record does allow is a careful comparison of technologies and material cultures, with the significant caveat that comparison does not imply competition, and that difference does not imply hierarchy. Neanderthals were producing the Mysterian toolkit, a technically sophisticated tradition involving prepared core flaking that allowed controlled production of specific tool forms from a single piece of stone. Some of the latest Neanderthal assemblages show evidence of something called the Châtel-Perronian, a tool-making tradition that incorporates elements associated with both Neanderthal and early modern human approaches, and that appears in a handful of Western European sites during the period of overlap. Whether this represents independent Neanderthal innovation, the adoption of ideas through contact, or some artifact of how archaeologists have categorized and dated the assemblages remains actively debated. The honest answer is that all three possibilities remain on the table, and the evidence does not cleanly resolve among them. What the comparison of technologies does not support is the older framework in which Homo sapiens arrived, carrying obviously superior tools and cognitive abilities that simply outcompeted a limited Neanderthal toolkit. The gap between the two traditions, examined carefully, and without the assumption that one must explain the other's disappearance, is narrower and more complicated than that framing suggests. Neanderthals had been hafting tools, hunting large game cooperatively, managing fire, occupying diverse environments, and burying their dead for a very long time before modern humans arrived in their range. If the technological difference explains the replacement, it requires specifying exactly what advantage was large enough to matter, and operating through what mechanism. That specification is much harder to produce than the general claim. Resource overlap is probably where the more tractable questions live, and here the timing matters considerably. The period of Neanderthal disappearance, roughly 45,000 to 40,000 years ago, coincides not only with sapiens' expansion but with another phase of climate instability. The Heinrich Event 4, a period of significant cooling associated with a pulse of ice into the North Atlantic that disrupted circulation patterns, falls within this window. Cold phases meant contracted resources, reduced prey density, smaller viable territories, and population fragmentation of the kind that the previous section described as an already familiar stress on Neanderthal metapopulations. Introducing a second population with overlapping dietary requirements into that same stressed landscape created a situation where small differences in reproductive rates, in foraging efficiency, in the breadth of dietary flexibility, or in network size could have compounded over generations into outcomes that look dramatic in the archaeological record, but were invisible at the level of individual lives. This is the mechanism that many researchers currently find most plausible, not a confrontation, but a slow demographic dilution. If modern human groups were maintaining even marginally higher population densities, or recovering from local collapses slightly faster, or supporting broader exchange networks that buffered individual group failures more effectively, those differences would not have needed to be large to produce the outcome observed over a few thousand years. The mathematics of population replacement do not require superiority. They require only a consistent, slight directional difference operating over enough time. And the time involved was thousands of years, which is long enough to absorb enormous local variation while still producing a clear directional trend in the aggregate. Interbreeding adds another layer of complexity to the replacement narrative. If the populations were producing viable offspring, then the boundary between them was permeable. Some of what we call Neanderthal genetic material did not disappear. It was incorporated. The people who eventually occupied Europe after 40,000 years ago were not a population that had simply replaced another. They were, in a meaningful genetic sense, partly descended from the population that had preceded them. The Neanderthal contribution to modern human genomes includes variants that affect immune function, skin and hair characteristics, and possibly adaptation to UV environments, suggesting that some of what was absorbed had genuine survival value in the environments where it was incorporated. This is not a footnote to the story of Neanderthal disappearance. It is part of the story itself. The sites where the last Neanderthal populations appear to have held on longest: Gibraltar in the far southwest of Europe. A few locations on the Iberian Peninsula, possibly parts of the Caucasus, are at the geographic margins, the same refugial zones that had sheltered Neanderthal populations through earlier climate crises. This pattern is consistent with a gradual range contraction, driven by the combination of climate pressure and population competition, rather than a sudden catastrophic displacement. The last known Neanderthal remains date to somewhere around 40,000 years ago, though dating at the boundary of radiocarbon reliability involves significant uncertainty, and some estimates push the final populations somewhat later, in isolated refugia. What the evidence does not support is a story of swift conquest. It does not support a story of cognitive inferiority passively accepting its own replacement. It does not support a story in which the cold finally killed them, or in which one decisive technological advantage swept them aside. What it supports is something more ambiguous and more human-scaled. Two populations, both descended from ancestors who had survived extraordinary pressures, both carrying the marks of long adaptation to hard landscapes, occupying the same terrain during a period of environmental stress, interacting in ways that were probably varied and locally specific, and arriving over several thousand years at an outcome in which one lineage persisted independently and the other did not, though not without leaving something of itself behind in every person who carries that small percentage of ancient European inheritance today. The picture we have of Neanderthal life is genuinely impressive given what we are working with: fragments of bone pulled from cave sediment, stone tools that survived because stone survives when almost nothing else does, Traces of ancient DNA extracted from teeth and fossils scattered across a dozen countries, sampled unevenly, preserved by accident of temperature and chemistry rather than any systematic plan, that we can say as much as we can is a remarkable achievement of science. But it is worth slowing down and being honest about the architecture of that knowledge, about where the foundations are solid and where they are considerably more provisional than confident summaries tend to imply. Ancient DNA has transformed the field more rapidly than almost any other methodological development in recent memory. A decade or two ago, the question of Neanderthal interbreeding with modern humans was genuinely unresolved, argued from morphology and inference. Now it is settled in its broad outlines. The interbreeding happened. The signal is in living human genomes, measurable, reproducible, real. Non-African populations today carry somewhere between 1 and 4% Neanderthal ancestry, depending on the individual and the population, and that figure represents genuine admixture events that occurred when ancestral modern humans encountered Neanderthal populations, most likely during the expansions through Western Asia and into Europe. The Neanderthal contribution to present-day genomes includes variants touching immune response, skin characteristics, and possibly metabolic function. These were not neutral passengers. Some of them were retained because they were useful in the environments where they ended up. What the ancient DNA evidence cannot tell us, and this matters, is how many times admixture occurred, in how many places or through what social mechanisms. The genetic signal we observe is consistent with a relatively small number of interbreeding events that produced offspring integrated into modern human lineages, but it does not resolve whether those events were rare and geographically concentrated, or more frequent and widespread, with most of the resulting lineages simply not surviving to the present. The absence of a stronger Neanderthal signal in modern genomes could mean interbreeding was genuinely infrequent, or it could mean that hybrid individuals faced disadvantages that reduced their representation over subsequent generations. A hypothesis some researchers have advanced based on patterns in which parts of the genome carry Neanderthal variants and which parts appear to have been selected against. Both interpretations remain active. The data supports neither conclusively on its own. Population size estimates from ancient DNA add another layer of complexity. Analysis of genetic diversity in Neanderthal samples suggests they maintained effective population sizes that were quite small throughout much of their existence, probably in the low thousands rather than tens of thousands at any given time. This is consistent with what their geographic distribution and ecological requirements would predict. Large-bodied, high trophic-level predators in cold environments tend toward lower population densities than generalist omnivores in richer landscapes. A small effective population size does not mean there were only a few thousand Neanderthals in Europe at any moment, but it does mean the population behaved genetically as though it was small, with limited gene flow between groups, repeated local bottlenecks, and reduced diversity relative to populations that maintained broader connectivity. That connectivity question is important and underappreciated. For a metapopulation to persist over hundreds of thousands of years the way Neanderthal populations did, dispersed across a continent experiencing repeated climate cycles of expansion and contraction, individual groups had to be exchanging individuals often enough to prevent total genetic isolation. The evidence suggests they were doing this, but the signal is not uniform across the range or across time. Some Neanderthal samples from different sites and different periods show genetic clustering that implies prolonged isolation between regional populations, separated enough that they accumulated distinct genetic signatures. Others show evidence of more recent mixing. The picture is not of a single pan-mictic population moving fluidly across Europe. It is of a patchwork, groups with their own local histories, sometimes connected and sometimes not, the whole system maintaining resilience through structure rather than through any single large and well-mixed population. This is where archaeology and genetics can pull in different directions, and where scientists have to do the careful work of reconciling them, rather than simply picking whichever source tells the simpler story. Genetic analysis of a Neanderthal specimen from one site might suggest relatedness to a specimen found hundreds of miles away and many thousands of years earlier, which seems to imply extensive connectivity. But the archaeological record at both sites might show entirely different tool traditions, suggesting these groups were not in regular contact in ways that left material traces. These apparent contradictions are not necessarily contradictions. Gene flow does not require frequent contact. A single individual moving between groups every few generations can maintain a detectable genetic connection without leaving any archaeological signature at all. But they do require care, and they are a reminder that each line of evidence has its own resolution, its own biases, and its own blind spots. Preservation and sampling bias shape the Neanderthal record more than is sometimes acknowledged in popular accounts. We know Neanderthals best from Western Europe, particularly from France, Spain, Belgium and Croatia, because those regions have a long history of archaeological excavation, good cave preservation, and institutional infrastructure for research. But Neanderthals occupied a range stretching from the Atlantic coast to the Altai Mountains in Siberia, from the fringes of the Middle East to the edges of the steppe. The populations we have sampled are not a representative cross-section of that range. They are the ones we happen to find, preserved in the conditions that permitted survival, excavated at the times and places when someone was looking. Sites in Central Asia, the Caucasus, and the Middle East are increasingly yielding Neanderthal material that complicates and enriches the picture, but the dataset remains deeply uneven. What this means in practice is that conclusions drawn from Western European Neanderthal samples may not generalize to the whole species. Claims about diet, behavior, mobility, and technology based primarily on French cave sites are describing one regional population across a portion of Neanderthal time. That population may have been broadly representative, or it may have had its own regional character shaped by local ecological and social conditions. We genuinely do not know how much variation existed across the full range because we have not sampled that range thoroughly enough to characterize it. Dating itself introduces uncertainties that tend to get smoothed over in summary narratives. Radiocarbon dating, the workhorse of Neanderthal chronology, has a practical limit of reliability somewhere around 50,000 years ago, and many of the most critical events in Neanderthal history, the late survival populations, the period of overlap with modern humans, the last known Neanderthal sites, fall right at that boundary where the method is least precise. Small systematic errors in sample preparation or contamination from younger carbon can shift dates by thousands of years. The reported range of Neanderthal disappearance times, from roughly 40,000 to perhaps 37,000 years ago in the most remote refugia, carries genuine uncertainty that the precision of published dates can obscure. When researchers say Neanderthals disappeared around 40,000 years ago, that is an approximation of an approximation, the best current estimate rather than a known fact. None of this is cause for despair about what we know. It is rather cause for appropriate calibration. The Neanderthals who survived Ice Age conditions for hundreds of thousands of years, who hunted large game in coordinated groups, who managed fire, constructed shelter, hafted tools, buried their dead, and eventually encountered and interbred with our own ancestors, that picture is built on real evidence. The broad outlines are not in serious dispute, but the texture of their lives, the variation between populations and places and times, the full range of what they were capable of remains largely beyond our current reach. Each new ancient DNA analysis, each newly excavated site, each refined dating technique shifts the picture, sometimes in small ways and occasionally in large ones. What science is doing with Neanderthals is not completing a puzzle whose final image is already known. It is building a picture from fragments that are never quite enough, using methods that are always improving, guided by questions that keep changing as the answers accumulate. The Neanderthal that emerges from that process is more capable, more varied, and more deeply connected to our own lineage than the simplified versions that persist in popular imagination. That is the actual finding, the one that cuts across all the individual studies and debates. Not a brutish cold-weather creature finally swept aside, but a long-adapted, cognitively capable population whose story intersects with ours in ways we are still working out how to describe accurately. The honest answer to most specific questions about Neanderthal life is that we know something, we suspect more, and there is still a great deal we simply cannot yet see. And so we arrive, gently, at the end of the story. Or at least at the end of the part of it we can currently tell. If you have stayed with this all the way through, you have travelled a considerable distance. You have walked through Ice Age landscapes where winters lasted longer than most modern calendars can comfortably hold. You have sat near fires that were tended with genuine skill, not lit by accident but managed with knowledge passed across generations. You have seen bodies shaped by cold, stocky and dense, and built to hold warmth, with nasal passages that could temper frozen air before it reached the lungs. You have watched small groups work together to bring down animals that were, by any reasonable measure, terrifying. You have followed people into caves and stone windbreaks and structures built from bone, into clothing stitched from hides and shaped to keep the wind out, into food strategies that reached far beyond the dramatic megafauna hunts that dominate the popular imagination. You have seen the ill-carried, the dead buried, the young taught, the injured healed well enough to survive for years. The full picture of how Neanderthals actually survived the Ice Age is not a simple one. It is a system. Heat management and fire and shelter and clothing and tools and diet and social care and seasonal movement, all of it interlocking, all of it necessary, none of it working without the rest. What brought that system to an end is, honestly, still a question without a clean answer. The disappearance of Neanderthals from the fossil and archaeological record somewhere in the window of 40,000 to perhaps 37,000 years ago was not, as far as the evidence can tell us, a single dramatic event. There was no battle that settled it, no plague we can identify in bone chemistry, no volcanic winter whose ash layer we can point to and say, there, that was when. What we have instead is a confluence of pressures, each individually perhaps manageable, but arriving together in a period when Neanderthal populations were already under strain. Modern humans moving out of Africa and into Western Asia and Europe brought with them a different social structure and possibly a different capacity for long-distance information exchange, for the kind of cultural transmission that could spread new technologies across vast networks faster than small isolated groups could adapt on their own. Whether that difference was decisive and in what specific ways remains genuinely debated. The genetic evidence shows interbreeding rather than simple replacement. The archaeological record shows overlap, sometimes for thousands of years in the same regions, which is not the signature of an immediate conquest. Whatever happened in that period of contact was slower and more complicated than the word replacement tends to suggest. Climate may have played a role as well. The period around 40,000 years ago included sharp climatic oscillations that compressed and fragmented the habitats Neanderthals had learned to use. Cold-adapted megafauna declined. The mosaic landscapes that had supported Neanderthal hunting strategies shifted in composition. A population already organized into small dispersed groups with limited genetic connectivity would have felt those pressures acutely, with fewer individuals to absorb losses and less capacity to recover from local extinction events. And there is the question of what we simply cannot see. Diseases carry no clear signature in the fossil record. Social disruption leaves no direct trace in stone tools. The slow, quiet disappearance of children who did not survive, of groups who moved and found nothing waiting for them on the other side, of knowledge traditions that died with the last person who held them, none of that fossilizes. The Neanderthal disappearance may have been less an event than a gradual thinning, a metapopulation slowly losing nodes in its network until there were not enough left to sustain the whole. What we can say with confidence is that some of what they carried survived. The Neanderthal contribution to living human genomes is real, and in certain respects functional. Immune variants, metabolic adaptations, characteristics suited to high latitudes and cold environments, all of it still present in the people alive today whose ancestors encountered Neanderthals in that long period of overlap. In a meaningful biological sense, the Neanderthal story did not end. It became part of another story, one that is still being written, including in the people who are listening to this right now. There is still a great deal the science has not resolved, and that is not a failure of science. It is simply an honest account of how far the evidence currently reaches. Ancient DNA methods continue to improve, and each new extraction from a previously unsampled site has the potential to shift what we think we know. Excavations in Central Asia, the Caucasus, the Middle East, and sites across the full geographic range of Neanderthal occupation are still in early stages compared to the long research history of Western Europe. New dating techniques are narrowing the uncertainty windows around critical moments. Sediment DNA analysis, which can detect the genetic presence of hominins even without skeletal remains, is opening sites and time periods that were previously inaccessible. The picture we have today is almost certainly not the picture we will have in 20 or 30 years. What those future findings will change, and in what direction, is genuinely unknown. That uncertainty is not a reason to withhold judgment about everything. It is a reason to hold the judgments we do have with appropriate lightness. What stays with you, if you let it, is not the specifics of any one study or any one site. It is the accumulated weight of what Neanderthals actually were, a lineage that persisted through repeated glacial cycles, through habitat collapses and megafaunal extinctions and the brutal arithmetic of small population survival for hundreds of thousands of years. They were not a failed experiment or a rough draft. They were a long-running, highly adapted, cognitively capable human population whose relationship to our own ancestors was more entangled and more intimate than the older stories ever suggested. Being human, it turns out, is not a single thing that appeared suddenly and swept everything else aside. It is a broad and complicated category with deep roots and multiple branches, and some of those branches lasted an extraordinarily long time by any reasonable measure. Neanderthals endured ice ages that would have broken most species. They did it through intelligence and cooperation and adaptability, through the quiet, unremarkable, essential work of keeping each other warm and fed and alive. There is something worth sitting with in that, as you settle in for the night. If this has given you something to think about quietly in the dark, we would genuinely love to hear from you. Leave a comment letting us know where in the world you are listening from tonight. Whether it is somewhere cold and dark or warm and still, knowing where these stories reach is one of the quiet pleasures of making them. If you have enjoyed the journey, a like and a subscription help more than you might think, and they let us know that slow, careful history told for the late hours of the day is something worth continuing. And if you find yourself wanting to go deeper into the world of prehistoric secrets and the lives of the people who came before us, we have a book that explores exactly that. You can find it and read more at sleepytimehistory.com. It is the kind of thing that pairs well with a quiet evening and a comfortable place to sit. Thank you for being here. Sleep well. The past is a long and patient place, and it will be waiting whenever you come back.